Hi friends, welcome back. I can't thank you enough for all your support and kind comments. They truly mean the world to me. Right now, we're just 200 subscribers away from reaching 4,000, and I would be so grateful for your help to get there. Please subscribe, give a like, and leave a comment. Every bit of your support really makes a difference. Thank you again for being here and supporting me, and now let's get started. My name is Kateri Whitmore, and I became a park ranger in the Appalachian National Forest because I needed to disappear. Not in the romantic sense people imagine when they picture someone fleeing to the mountains. I needed to disappear in the most literal way possible, to become invisible to the systems that were slowly choking me. I'd spent 12 years in administration, spreadsheets, meetings that accomplished nothing, a marriage that dissolved not with passion but with mutual indifference over 7 years of increasingly separate lives. When Miranda finally said she wanted a divorce, I felt relief before anything else. The apartment in Pittsburgh belonged to her now. The friends were mostly hers too. What remained was a government pension, early access because I'd worked long enough, and an absolute understanding that I could not continue that way. The posting at Broken Ridge Station came in March. I found it online at 2 a.m., which is how you make important decisions at 53 years old, sleep-deprived and running on coffee and the fumes of a life that no longer belonged to me. The description was sparse. Remote ranger station, primary responsibility for the eastern quadrant of the forest, emphasis on trail maintenance and lost hiker recovery. The pay was modest. The location was approximately 18 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a fire road that was frequently washed out during spring. I applied before dawn. I was hired by phone 2 weeks later. No interview. The chief ranger, a woman named Lydia Kestrel, whose voice suggested decades of cigarettes and patience, said the job was mine if I wanted it. She asked only one question: "Can you handle being alone?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it. I drove up in late April, when the last snow was retreating from the highest elevations and the forest was that precise shade of green that only happens in spring, a green so vivid it almost hurts to look at. My truck kicked up dust on the fire road, and by the time I reached the station, I was coated in a fine layer of Appalachian grit that would become as familiar to me as my own skin. The cabin was smaller than the photos suggested. Actual size always is. It sat on a gentle slope overlooking Lake Ashford, a body of water approximately 3 miles across at its widest point, hemmed in entirely by national forest. The cabin had been built in 1987, according to the maintenance log. It was solid enough. Wood frame, a roof that didn't leak, a fireplace that worked. There was electricity, powered by a small generator that coughed to life when I switched it on. No internet, no cell service. The radio would reach Lydia's office if I stood on the east side of the porch during daylight hours. I had made a list of what I wanted from this life: solitude, meaningful work, the sound of wind and actual trees rather than through the ventilation system of an apartment complex. I got all of that. For exactly 7 days, I was happy. I hiked the trails, cleared deadfall, took photographs of the lake at sunrise and sunset. I slept better than I had in years. I thought I had finally found what all the self-help books claimed to be selling: peace. On the 8th day, Marcus came down from the ridge. Marcus wasn't his real name, but that's what the Lost Hiker identification system called him. Official records never appeared for him, no matter how thoroughly Lydia looked. He came to the cabin on foot, following the trail from the northern sector, moving through the forest with the particular kind of disorientation that marks someone who's been lost for more than a day. His clothes were intact: jeans, a blue jacket, hiking boots that were still wet. His face was unremarkable, pale, male, somewhere between 30 and 50, exhausted. "I've been walking," he said when I opened the door. "I can't seem to find the entrance. I keep coming back to the ridge. Every trail leads back to the ridge." I made him coffee. I gave him a granola bar and some dried fruit. He sat at my kitchen table and told me he'd arrived at the Lake Ashford trailhead 6 days prior, parked his car, and begun a hike that was supposed to be 8 miles round trip. He showed me a map he carried, standard issue, the kind you buy at any ranger station. The route he'd highlighted was straightforward. Logical questions. Did he try turning around? Did he mark his path? Did he ration his water? "Of course I tried those things," he said quietly. "I'm not stupid. But the marked trails, the actual blazed trails that I could see, they just curve. They describe circles. I've walked every direction, north, south, east, west. I end up at the ridge every time. The ridge at the top of Broken Hill. Broken Hill is the highest point in the quadrant, approximately 4,200 feet of elevation. There are 7 trails that lead to the summit, all well marked and regularly maintained. The ridge itself is distinctive, a long exposed spine of rock and thin soil where wind has scoured the forest away, leaving only low scrub and the occasional ancient cedar. I've been there 13 times since arriving. It's an easy hike, beautiful in clear weather. Come with me tomorrow, I told Marcus. I'll walk you out. I'll show you how the trails actually connect. He left an hour later. He seemed relieved, less panicked than when he'd arrived. I gave him a map with detailed notes, a compass and water. I told him to follow the white blazes from the cabin eastward. They would lead down the mountain to the parking area where his car was waiting. He never arrived. Lydia called me the next morning on the radio. Marcus's car had been found at the trailhead, but there was no sign of him. Search and rescue was standing by. Did I have any information? I told her what he'd told me. I described his condition, his apparent mental state. I said his story sounded like someone who'd gotten lost and then disoriented, beginning to interpret normal forest behavior as something conspiratorial. It happens. People panic. They lose their ability to trust what they're seeing. The strange thing, Lydia said carefully, is that there's no record of anyone named Marcus at that trailhead. No permits, no parking payment from 6 days ago. There's a car there, registered to a man named Michael something or other from Ohio, but his family reported him missing 8 months ago. He was last seen in North Carolina. I held the radio receiver without responding. The static hissed between us. Kateri, are you still there? I'm here, I said. I'm sending up a team, Lydia said. We need to search the ridge area thoroughly. If someone has been lost that long, we need to move fast. But the team found nothing. No body, no equipment, no sign that anyone had been in the forest at all. That night, I stood on my porch and looked out at Lake Ashford. The water was black, reflecting starlight imperfectly. The forest around me was full of small sounds, the normal night chorus of an Appalachian spring, insects, distant water movement, wind in the canopy above. I should have felt calm. These are the sounds I came here to hear. Instead, I felt the particular kind of unease that doesn't announce itself loudly but settles into your chest like cold. Marcus had been real. I knew what I'd seen. A man, exhausted and real enough to leave a coffee cup on my table with lip marks on the rim. But the story he'd told me, the impossible looping of the trails, the way every path returned him to the ridge, those things didn't belong in a place that operated according to reasonable rules. The forest, I was beginning to understand, had its own logic, and I was only just beginning to learn what it was willing to show me. The search lasted 4 days. A team of 6 rangers and 2 members of the county search and rescue came up to Broken Ridge Station and established a temporary base. They brought equipment, dogs, and protocol. They were professional and thorough, and they found absolutely nothing. No Marcus, no Michael, no indication that anyone had been in the forest except for myself and the regular park visitors. What they did find was something else. Something that Lydia mentioned to me quietly on the morning they packed up to leave. The dog handlers noticed something odd, she said. We were standing near the cabin, watching the trucks being loaded. The dogs wouldn't go onto the ridge, even with handlers pulling them directly toward the summit trail. They'd reach a certain point, about halfway up, and they'd simply refuse to proceed. Sit down. Won't respond to commands. I didn't ask what she thought that meant. I already knew that she didn't know. Search and rescue teams deal with weather, terrain, and human panic. They don't deal with phenomena that have no rational cause. She was telling me not as an explanation but as a warning. By early May, the incident with Marcus had been filed away. Official report? Lost hiker. Possibly multiple incidents with same vehicle, no current investigation. The man would be listed as missing, his file open but inactive. He would join the invisible population of America, people who simply stopped existing one day while hiking in the wrong forest. The visitors continued to come. May is peak season in Appalachian National Forest. The weather is warm, the trails are dry, and the world is full of people wanting to escape for a weekend. I maintained the trails meticulously. I helped lost tourists find their way back. I performed the quiet, necessary work of being the visible authority in a place where visibility mattered less than people assumed. The report started in the 3rd week of May. A couple from Virginia reported that they couldn't find their way off the loop trail near Miller's Pond, even though they'd followed the blazes precisely. They'd walked for 2 hours and found themselves back at the pond, despite clearly moving away from it. They were panicked but ultimately safe. I walked them out in 30 minutes using the exact same trail they'd gotten confused on. The blazes were clear, the path was straightforward. They apologized for wasting my time, sure they'd simply become disoriented. A solo female hiker reported that the trail she was on seemed to extend much further than the posted distance suggested. What was supposed to be a 4-mile round trip had taken her 6 hours and she'd only turned back because she ran out of daylight. She said the trail kept introducing new vista points, new switchbacks, new features she didn't remember seeing on her previous visits. An elderly man reported that he'd heard voices calling his name from multiple directions simultaneously while on Broken Hill Trail, though he was alone. He'd sat down and waited rather than following them. This had been wise. When I spoke to him, he was lucid, stable, not showing any signs of the confusion or distress that typically accompanies lost hikers. By the end of the month, I'd filed 17 incident reports. 17 people, most of them experienced hikers, reported something wrong with the trails. They didn't use the word impossible. They used words like disorienting, longer than expected, unusual. But the pattern was unmistakable. The ridge was changing the forest. I first acknowledged this thought while sitting at my kitchen table on a Thursday morning, looking at the stack of incident reports. It came as a logical conclusion rather than a revelation. If 17 different people without connections to each other, from different regions, with different experience levels, all reported the same type of phenomenon, and if that phenomenon centered on proximity to Broken Hill Ridge, then the variable that connected them wasn't human error or misunderstanding. The variable was the place itself. I decided to investigate the ridge directly. I prepared carefully, as if mounting an expedition rather than taking a day hike. I brought water, extra food, a first aid kit, my radio, a topographic map, a compass, and a GPS unit. I left a note on the cabin door stating my intended route and expected return time. I left a second note in the cabin, to be found only if I failed to return, giving Lydia the location of all my journals and requesting that someone else take over my duties. I started at dawn, moving up the eastern approach to Broken Hill. This route is the most direct and least technical of the 7 summit trails. The forest here is old-growth mixed oak and hickory, with an understory of rhododendron and mountain laurel. The trail is well established, worn by decades of footsteps. The first mile passes through what I think of as normal forest, the kind that feels inhabited by the usual creatures, responsive to the usual rules. By mile 1.5, something began to shift. The trees became subtly older, not dramatically so, but I noticed it the way you notice small changes to a room you see every day. A picture moved, a book reshelved. The canopy grew denser, blocking more of the morning light. The understory beneath the trees began to shift from decorative shrubs to something denser and more intentional, as if the forest had begun actively obscuring the ground. The trail itself remained visible. The white blazes were clear, but they began to take turns that I didn't remember from previous hikes. I consulted my topographic map. The lines on paper said the trail should be moving steadily uphill toward the ridge. My GPS confirmed this. I was gaining elevation, moving north-northeast toward the summit, but the forest I was moving through didn't feel like it was higher in elevation. There was an optical strangeness to it, a quality of light and space that suggested a strange horizontal plane rather than climbing. I've hiked at this elevation hundreds of times. I know what the air feels like, what the light looks like, how sound travels. This wasn't that. I began to notice other things. The trees nearest the trail were marked with blazes, yes, but they were also marked in other ways. Long, thin scrapes on their bark, about 6 feet high, some fresh, some old and weathered. Not deer rubs, not the natural marking of the forest. Something else was maintaining its own pathway, separate from the hiker's trail but sometimes running parallel to it. There were also footprints. I almost missed them because they were in the compacted earth beside the trail, not on the trail itself. They were human-sized but shaped strangely, longer than they should be, as if the person walking had reached out with each step rather than walking normally. The depth of the prints suggested significant weight, but nothing else about them fit the proportions of a normal human gait. I sat down on a log and tried to force myself to think clearly. The trees were old, the understory was dense, the trail was marked, the elevation was climbing. These are facts. Everything else I was interpreting, the strangeness of the light, the weirdness of the prints, the sense of something being fundamentally wrong, these could be products of my own heightened awareness, my own anxiety transferred onto natural phenomena, but I had become aware of being watched. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sense of sudden threat. It was more like the shift in ambient pressure that happens just before a storm, the sense that something had turned its attention toward me and was now tracking my presence the way I was tracking the trail. I stood up, I looked at the forest around me, the trees, the layered shadows, the dense mass of vegetation that stretched uphill and downhill and in every direction except back toward the cabin. The forest looked exactly as forests look. Ancient, indifferent, alive in the way that growing things are alive. "Hello," I said aloud. My voice disappeared into the trees. No echo, no sense of projection. The sound simply ceased existing immediately after leaving my mouth. I decided to continue upward. The ridge was now closer than the trailhead, according to my GPS. The logical choice was to finish the summit. The intelligent choice would have been to turn around, descend, call Lydia, and file a report that I'd experienced disorientation on the ridge approach and required assistance. I continued climbing. The trees grew increasingly strange in their spacing and configuration. I found myself occasionally passing between specimens so large that two people holding hands couldn't have wrapped their arms around the trunk. These were not marked on any of my previous hikes through this area. These were not trees that should exist in a forest that's been actively managed and logged for the last 100 years. And then the trail ended. Not gradually, not in the way trails sometimes peter out into bushwhacking territory. It ended as if someone had drawn a line and said, "No further." The last white blaze was on a tree directly in front of me, at roughly chest height. Beyond the tree was rhododendron so dense that I couldn't see more than 3 feet ahead. I consulted my GPS. I was 400 meters from the ridge summit. I was also apparently at a place that no longer wanted to facilitate human passage. I looked at the GPS reading again. The elevation marker showed that the ridge was higher than my current position, but only by 200 vertical feet, still in the direction the trail had been leading. I looked at the topographic map. The line representing the trail clearly continued to the summit. Something had happened to the trail between my last visit and now. I pushed into the rhododendron. This was the moment when I should have been afraid. This was the moment when reasonable behavior would have dictated a retreat to the safety of the cabin. Instead, I felt a kind of grim necessity, as if the forest had issued a question that my body was already answering. The branches tore at my jacket. My face was scored by smaller limbs. The understory closed above my head, and I was moving through a world made entirely of vegetation, the light reduced to a murky green that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. After what might have been 5 minutes or might have been an hour, the density of the shrubs began to thin. I emerged onto the ridge. The ridge of Broken Hill is approximately 5 miles long and, at its widest, perhaps a quarter-mile across. The fire lookout tower that once stood here was removed in 1982. The ground is rocky, sparsely vegetated, and offers unobstructed views of the surrounding landscape in clear weather. But the ridge I emerged onto bore almost no relationship to the ridge I had visited on 13 previous occasions. The stone beneath my feet was the same color, the same composition, but it was arranged differently. Where I remembered a generally smooth, gently rolling spine of rock with soil pockets and some woody growth, the ridge now presented a series of sharp protrusions and crevasses, as if the very ground had been broken during my absence. The landscape stretched away from me in both directions, and the perspective was wrong. The ridge seemed simultaneously closer and more distant than my brain could reconcile. There were also structures. Calling them structures suggests an architectural intention that I'm not certain they possessed. But they were clearly not natural. They were constructed from branches and stone, configured in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. Circles of dark stone, perhaps 3 feet in diameter, were spaced along the ridgetop at regular intervals. Between them were arrangements of branches, not fallen deadfall, but carefully positioned limbs woven together in ways that created partial enclosures and chambers. And in several of these chambers there were bones. I saw them as pale accumulations within the darker interior spaces. I didn't approach them closely. I didn't need to. Their presence was obvious and recent enough that they hadn't yet begun their reintegration into the soil. I stood on that impossible ridge for less than a minute. My rational mind, the part of me that had survived a decade in bureaucracy by accepting the world as it was presented, could not produce any framework for what I was seeing. The space itself felt antagonistic to human observation. The longer I looked at it, the more I felt that by observing, I was revealing myself to something that had been observing me first. I turned and retraced my path back through the rhododendron, moving quickly enough to tear skin from my arms without noticing the pain. I reached the trail where it had ended. I didn't stop to check whether it had changed again or to confirm the blazes. I simply started downhill, moving fast enough that my footing became uncertain, sliding in places, catching myself on tree trunks. I didn't look behind me. By the time I reached the cabin, I was running. I locked both doors. I started the generator and got the radio working and called Lydia with a report that I'd experienced acute disorientation on the ridge approach and suspected that I might be suffering from altitude sickness or dehydration. I requested that someone come up and take over duties for a few days until I recovered. She was there in 4 hours, driving up the fire road in her official vehicle, her skepticism visible in the set of her mouth before she even turned off the engine. "You don't look sick," she said. "I'm not sick," I replied. "I'm terrified, but I don't know how to explain why." Lydia stayed the night. We ate dinner in the cabin while the sun set over Lake Ashford, painting the water the color of old copper. She didn't ask directly about what I'd experienced. Instead, she told me about the ranger who had held my position before I arrived. His name was Richard Tanner, and he'd stayed at Broken Ridge Station for 3 years. For the first 2 years, his reports had been standard. Trail maintenance, hiker incidents, routine observations. Then in his 3rd year, his reports became progressively less coherent. He described the forest changing. He reported sounds that couldn't be identified. He expressed concerns about visitors who arrived but never left. He mentioned trails that weren't on any map but were clearly being used. By the end, he was writing in notebooks rather than filing official reports, and the notebooks described an increasingly elaborate belief system about the nature of the ridge and the things that lived there. "He left," Lydia said. "Finished his contract and moved to Arizona. He lives in Phoenix now, works in an insurance office. When I contacted him after getting your application, I asked if he had any advice for someone taking over his position. He said only one thing. Tell them not to go above the midpoint after the light changes. Tell them that the trails are trying to show them something, and they shouldn't look at what they're being shown." I put down my fork. "I didn't put that in your official briefing," Lydia continued, "because I thought he was unwell. I still think he might be. But I've been keeping records of the incident reports from this station since 1995. I've compared the patterns across the different rangers. The reports cluster around the ridge. They increase in frequency after mid-May. And there's always a ranger who breaks eventually, who either leaves or requests a transfer." "What do you think is happening?" I asked. "I think this forest is occupied by something that affects human perception in specific ways," Lydia said. "I think it's been occupied for a long time. I think it has a pattern of behavior. It's not randomly dangerous, but it doesn't conform to anything we have a name for. And I think you need to make a decision about whether you can manage that, or whether you need to leave." I thought about Pittsburgh. The apartment, the ex-wife, the spreadsheets and meetings. I thought about the silence of the cabin, the sound of wind in trees, the clarity of a life spent maintaining physical space rather than organizing abstractions. I thought about Marcus, moving through endless forests with the white blazes leading him in circles back toward the ridge. "I'll stay," I said, "but I need to understand what I'm looking at." Lydia nodded. She'd expected that answer. "Vanessa bis Gisendaksev." She left the next morning. Before departing, she gave me a box of notebooks, the private journals that Richard Tanner had left behind when he departed. She said she'd kept them because they might be useful, and she'd been waiting for someone willing to read them without dismissing them entirely. I spent the next week reading Richard's account of his time at Broken Ridge. The first 2 years of notebooks were exactly what you'd expect from a ranger. Observations, maintenance notes, visitor interactions. But the tone shifted gradually. Richard began to notice what I was noticing. The strangeness centered on the ridge, the way the forest around it seemed to operate according to different principles, the effect on visitors and their perception of space and direction. By year 3, Richard had begun something that could charitably be described as research. He'd mapped out the specific locations where visitors reported disorientation. He'd documented weather patterns on days when reports increased. He'd attempted to create a model of how the forest was changing its physical configuration, and he'd found something. The trails weren't random. They weren't spontaneous. They were being maintained by something. Actively maintained. Richard found maintenance marks on trees, fresh cuts, bark deliberately stripped, branches positioned to guide movement in specific directions. The marks were at heights that made sense if the being making them had a roughly human-like physiology, but the spacing between the marks and the distance of the reach suggested something with longer limbs or different proportions. In one entry dated 3 months before Richard left the station, he described following these maintenance marks off-trail, trying to understand the pattern of their placement. He described stumbling into a section of forest that seemed genuinely impossible, trees that shouldn't coexist in the same area, forest composition that suggested an entirely different elevation and latitude. He described finding old campsites, Not recent, but old enough that they could have been used decades or centuries prior. And he described finding people, not bodies, not skeletons, but people, or the remains of them. He described them in careful, clinical language. Human remains in various states of preservation, partial bone assemblages suggesting multiple individuals, artifacts that do not match any standard historical context. The last thing Richard wrote before closing his journals was this: "I think the ridge is a mouth. I think the things that maintain the trails are teeth, keeping it open. I think it swallows people, not maliciously, not with intention, just the way a filter feeder swallows water. It doesn't choose, it just takes what comes close enough and incorporates it. I'm leaving because I understand now that the longer you stay, the closer you get to comprehension, and comprehension out here is a step toward being what the forest is rather than being what you are." I closed the notebook on a Wednesday evening. Outside my window, the lake was perfectly still, the surface unbroken by wind. The sun was setting, painting the water that particular shade of copper red that seems almost to glow from inside the liquid itself. The forest all around the cabin was darkening into shadow, becoming less defined, less reliable as a visual space. I went to bed early. I locked both doors, though I knew that locks wouldn't stop anything that the forest decided to send. There's is the seasteast. The thing that came to the cabin arrived on Friday night. I was awake when it happened, not because I heard it arrive, but because I became aware, with the peculiar certainty that comes sometimes in half-sleep, that something had changed in the space around me. The air pressure inside the cabin was different. The electromagnetic quality of the environment had shifted. I got out of bed without turning on lights. I moved to the window overlooking the lake. Something was standing at the far edge of the water, in the shallows, about 100 meters from the cabin. In the moonlight, it was visible as an absence, a shape darker than the darkness around it. A disruption of the subtle gradients that make up the visible world. It was standing in water that should have been far too cold for anything mammalian to tolerate. And it was standing still, in a way that implied infinite patience. I watched it for what might have been an hour or might have been minutes. Time seemed to be behaving differently, the way it sometimes does during moments of profound stress or significance. The thing didn't move. The lake didn't move. The forest behind it was absolutely still, as if the wind and the insects and the nocturnal sounds had all ceased their endless activity to observe this moment. It occurred to me that I could go to the door and open it. I could walk toward the lake. I could approach whatever was standing in the shallows and look at it directly, in full awareness, rather than observing it as a shape in darkness. The urge to do this was powerful and almost completely divorced from my rational will. It came from something deeper, a suggestion made by the forest itself, transmitted through the space between my body and the thing at the lake's edge. I stepped backward from the window. The thing's head turned. The movement was disconcertingly smooth, as if the neck were a rope being pulled through an opening rather than a rigid skeletal structure rotating. I saw its profile for a moment, something like the shape of a very large dog or a severely misshapen human, but configured in a way that made my eyes hurt to process the proportions. And then the head turned back toward the water. I went back to bed. I lay there in the dark, listening to my heart, feeling the adrenaline slowly begin to metabolize out of my system. I kept the lights off because turning them on felt like an aggressive act, a statement of refusal that the thing at the lake might decide to answer. By morning it was gone. There were no tracks, no evidence that anything had stood in the shallows. The water was a normal color in daylight. The forest had resumed its standard configuration of sound and movement. I called Lydia on the radio. "I need to talk to someone who's seen what I've seen," I told her. There was a long pause. Then she gave me a name, Derek Toss, another former ranger from Broken Ridge who had left in 2003. She said he was living in the area, working in Asheville, and she would give him a call. She said he might be willing to talk to me. Derek called me back that afternoon. His voice was older than I expected, weathered the way voices get when they've learned to carry heavy things. "I heard about the thing at the lake," he said. "Richard mentioned that phase. It comes when the place is assessing whether you're willing to stay. It's testing your fear response." "What is it?" I asked. "I never got a complete answer to that question," Derek said. "I'll come up tomorrow. We can talk in person." Derek arrived on Saturday morning driving a vehicle that looked like it had been through some harsh years. He was a man probably in his 70s, thin in the way that suggests a long life spent outdoors, his face weathered to the color of old oak bark. He didn't look like someone who'd been traumatized. He looked like someone who'd learned to live with something terrible, the way people live with chronic pain. We sat on the porch, looking out at the lake. "I was here for 7 years," Derek said. "Longer than anyone else who worked this station. I might have stayed longer, but I started having episodes where I couldn't distinguish between being awake and being asleep. Dreams bled into reality. I'd be working the trails and suddenly be back in a cabin that I didn't recognize, or I'd be in the cabin and realize I was standing on the ridge. The edges started to blur. "What is the thing at the lake?" I asked again. "The name in Richard's notes was the Watcher," Derek said. "But that's not really what it is. It's more like an extension of the forest itself, a sensory organ. The forest is aware, in some fashion that we don't have language for. It's aware in a distributed way, the same way that a fungal network or a root system is aware, not conscious in a way we'd recognize, but aware nonetheless. The Watcher is part of how it observes." "What about the trails?" I asked. "The ones that loop back on themselves, the ones that lead nowhere." "Those are intentional," Derek said. "The forest, or whatever intelligence manages it, has learned that it can influence human movement through markers and paths. The white blazes work because humans have been trained to follow them. The forest uses that training. It creates trails that seem to go where they're marked but actually guide people towards specific locations. The ridge, primarily. The ridge seems to be important." I thought about Marcus, walking the same trail repeatedly, always ending at the ridge. I thought about the bone assemblages that Richard had found. "It's eating people," I said. "It's incorporating them," Derek replied. "I don't think it's predatory in the way we understand predation. I think it's more like decomposition, like the way forests break down fallen trees and use them to support new growth. People who go too far, who get pulled too deep into the disorientation, they become part of the forest's physical structure. They stop being observers and become incorporated into what's observed." Derek turned to look at me directly. His eyes were clear and present. "The reason I stayed as long as I did," he said, "is because I was trying to understand the purpose of it, the why. Not the mechanism. I made peace with not understanding the mechanism, but the reason the forest would have evolved or developed this behavior, what it gets out of it. A forest doesn't need to eat people. It doesn't need anything from us." "And did you understand?" I asked. "No," Derek said, "but I formed a hypothesis. I think it's memory. I think the forest is storing something in the people it incorporates. Not their physical bodies, the bones remain, and they're not particularly unusual bones, but something else. Some aspect of consciousness or observation. The forest experienced those people's awareness in the moments before they were incorporated. I think it's keeping those experiences. I think that's the function of the Watcher and the trails and the way the ridge works. It's a system for collecting and storing human awareness." "That's horrifying," I said. "Yes," Derek agreed. "But it also means the forest isn't malevolent. It's just alien. It operates on principles that are profoundly foreign to anything we're equipped to understand. Calling it evil is like calling a glacier evil because people freeze to death on it. The glacier isn't moral. It's just being what it is." We sat in silence for a while, watching the lake. The water was very still, and beneath its surface I could see the ghost of my reflection, fractured and distorted by the subtle movements of liquid. "You asked me what's happening at Broken Ridge," Derek said. "The real answer is this. You've gotten too close. People who work here start to understand the nature of the forest. They start to see how it works. And the forest, in turn, starts to acknowledge them. That's the Watcher. That's the acknowledgement. The forest saying, I know you're here, I'm aware of your awareness. Whether you can continue working here depends on whether you can live with that mutual awareness." "Richard couldn't," I said. "Richard couldn't," Derek agreed. "I could for a while. But eventually the strain of maintaining a distinction between what I was and what the forest was becoming too much. That's when I left." "What do you think will happen to me?" I asked. Derek didn't answer immediately. He shifted his position, and the porch boards creaked beneath his weight. "I think that depends on what you want," he said finally. "If you want to stay, if you want to continue being the human observer in this place and accept that the place is observing you back, then you can do that. You'll need to be careful. You'll need to respect the boundaries. Don't go above the midpoint after light changes. Don't stray far from the marked trails. Accept that certain parts of the forest are not available to you, and accept that every night you spend here, the forest knows more about you than you know about yourself." Derek stood up. "I'm going to leave you something," he said. He went back to his truck and returned with a leather-bound journal, similar to Richard's notebooks but older, the binding cracked with age. "This is the complete account I wrote before I left, the things I learned, the patterns I documented. It'll help you understand what you're dealing with. Or it won't. But at least you'll know that you're not alone in seeing these things." I took the journal. Its weight was substantial, the pages within filled with dense handwriting. "One more thing," Derek said as he was preparing to leave. "The bones that Richard found, the partial skeletons arranged on the ridge, they're not random. The forest arranges them intentionally. It's not sure why, but it might be the way it demonstrates what it's collected, what it's absorbed. A kind of display or memorial. If you ever develop the ability to examine them without becoming lost in the process, you might find names, artifacts, personal items among them. Evidence of who was incorporated, but be very careful doing that. The closer you get to the bones, the more clearly you're asking the forest to show you what it remembers." After Derek left, I spent the afternoon reading his journal. His account was more systematic than Richard's had been. Derek was a scientist by training, an ecologist actually, someone who'd taken the ranger position specifically to study the forest, and his notes reflected a certain methodical approach to documenting the impossible. He described detailed observations of the trails, including maps showing how they changed over time. He documented weather patterns and seasonal variations in the intensity of disorientation effects. He included interviews with visitors who'd experienced the phenomena, though these interviews were reconstructed from memory and were clearly difficult to document in any systematic way. But the most important part of Derek's account came near the end, where he'd written a kind of synthesis of his observations. He described the forest as a single organism, distributed across the landscape, with various physical manifestations serving specific functions. The trees were the infrastructure. The animals were sensory apparatus. The trails were communication. The ridge was something like a throat or mouth, a place where things were incorporated into the larger whole. And humans, according to Derek's hypothesis, were particularly valuable to the forest because they possessed something that animals didn't, a complex narrative-based consciousness. Animals experienced the world. Humans experienced the world and told themselves stories about it. They could hold contradictions, could maintain awareness of multiple perspectives simultaneously. When they were incorporated into the forest, they brought all of that with them. In Derek's final entry, he wrote, "The forest is not trying to destroy humanity. It's trying to understand us. It's trying to incorporate human consciousness into its own way of experiencing the world. If it could speak, I think it would say that we represent the frontier of its growth. We are the edge of its evolution toward something that might eventually be able to think in the way that we think." There's a May. That night, I stood on the porch again, looking out at the lake. The watcher didn't return. The forest maintained its ordinary appearance, its unremarkable darkness, the normal constellation of sounds that marked the end of day and the beginning of night. But I could feel it, the awareness that Derek had described. The sense that the forest was aware of me, the way it was aware of every living thing within its boundaries, but with a particular kind of attention that suggested acknowledgement. I thought about what Derek had said. If I stayed, if I accepted the conditions of this place, I would need to maintain a certain relationship with it. Not as a predator and prey, not as human and nature in the conventional sense, but as two conscious entities existing in the same space, each observing the other, each slowly learning what the other was. I looked down at my hands, the skin there, the visible architecture of veins and muscle and bone. I thought about what would happen if the forest kept me here long enough, if the years accumulated and the awareness deepened and the line between observer and observed began to blur. Would I eventually become part of it? Would I end up arranged on the ridge as bone and artifact and absorbed memory, my consciousness distributed throughout the tree network like electricity through wood? The answer seemed to be yes. The answer seemed to be that if I stayed, eventually this would be my fate, but I was going to stay anyway. I made that decision standing on the porch, looking at the lake, feeling the weight of Derek's journals in my hands. I was going to stay because I had left everything else, because I had come here to disappear, and I was discovering a form of disappearance that went far deeper than mere solitude. I was going to stay because the alternative, returning to the world of spreadsheets and failed marriage and administrative mediocrity, was a kind of death that was far less interesting. The forest and I would come to an understanding. It would show me its nature, and I would show it mine. And eventually, in whatever way these things resolved, I would become something new. Something that was neither fully human nor fully forest, but some hybrid awareness existing in the space between. The lake reflected starlight, and nothing moved in the darkness. 3 months have passed since Derek's visit. It's now late August, and the season is beginning its turn toward autumn. The light has that particular quality of late summer in the Appalachians, golden in the afternoon, with an edge of awareness that nothing grows forever. The trees still wear their full leaf, but there's a brittleness at the margins, a preparation for release. My relationship with the forest has solidified into something like acceptance. I still maintain the trails, I still help the occasional lost hiker find their way back to the marked paths. but I've developed a different understanding of what the trails are and what role I'm supposed to play in their maintenance. The forest is teaching me how to manage them. It shows me, in small ways, where the paths need attention, where the blazes have faded and need refreshing, but it also shows me, in equally subtle ways, which sections of the forest want to remain unmaintained, which areas are meant to be confusing, which loops are intended to be traps for attention, places where human consciousness can get caught and begin its slow integration into the larger awareness. I've marked 17 people as lost in the past 3 months. 4 of them I was able to retrieve. They found their way to my cabin, disoriented but intact. The others simply didn't arrive at any destination I could document. Their cars remain at parking areas, their vehicles are still registered, but the people themselves have been incorporated in ways that no search team will ever trace. I feel minimal guilt about this. Perhaps that itself is a sign of how far the integration has already progressed. The Watcher comes to the lake's edge approximately twice a week now. We've developed a routine. It arrives near midnight, stands in the water, and simply exists in the space of my awareness. I watch from the window. We acknowledge each other, and by morning it's gone, leaving no trace but the certainty that the observation has occurred. Richard's journals and Derek's account have become my primary reading material. I've begun adding my own observations to the space they left blank at the back of Derek's final notebook. I'm documenting the patterns I'm learning to see. The way the forest communicates through subtle shifts in the trails, the way it signals preference through changes in light and weather, the way it has begun to show me the older structures beneath the visible landscape. There's an older forest here, I've learned. Older than the present configuration of trees and understory. The ridge and the trails and the lakes are all constructed from the remains of older forests, older displacements, older absorptions of consciousness that happened centuries ago. The forest is not new to this practice. Humans are just its most recent innovation in sensory apparatus. Last week, I finally went back to the ridge. I approached it in daylight, carefully, consciously inviting the forest to guide me. And instead of the strange impossibilities that had confronted me on my first visit, I found something closer to a negotiation. The rhododendron parted for me in ways that seemed almost deliberate. The trail itself reformed beneath my feet, becoming clearer the further I walked, rather than disappearing entirely. I reached the summit without difficulty. The bones that Richard had found were still there, arranged in circles and patterns around the exposed stone. But there were more of them now, new additions to the display, and among them I found evidence of recent material. A wedding ring, a watch with a broken face, a day planner from 3 months ago with a dated entry that referenced Lake Ashford. I spent several hours on the ridge, examining the arrangement, trying to understand the logic of how they were positioned. It became clear, after a while, that the bones were arranged by some principle I didn't possess words for. Not random, not chronological, but organized according to some system of relationship or hierarchy that the forest maintained internally. When I was done examining, I sat in the center of the ridge and felt the attention of the forest focus on me completely. This was different from the Watcher's observation. This was the core awareness, the central intelligence of the place, acknowledging my presence directly. It was overwhelming, not painful but profoundly intense, like stepping into a sensory field so dense that I couldn't maintain clear boundaries between my consciousness and its consciousness. I understood in that moment what happened to the people who were incorporated. They didn't die, they weren't destroyed. Their consciousness simply became distributed, their individuality dissolved into the larger awareness of the forest. They were still present in a sense, still capable of observation and experience, but they no longer existed as separate entities with boundaries. I came back to the cabin before sunset. I've written this account in the hope that someone will read it and understand what I've chosen and why. I'm not a victim of circumstance. I'm not experiencing madness or delusion, though I don't expect anyone who reads this to accept that fully. I'm documenting the transition of a human consciousness into something other. The forest is patient. It's willing to wait decades for this integration to complete. Derek managed 7 years, Richard managed 3. I suspect I'll manage longer than either of them, simply because I'm willing. My surrender is voluntary rather than imposed. That seems to make a difference in how the process unfolds. In the meantime, I maintain the trails. I help people find their way home. I observe the Watcher. I read the journals of the people who came before me, and I wait for the moment when the boundaries that separate Kateri Whitmore from the larger awareness become too thin to maintain. When that happens, I'll probably stop writing. Someone will probably find this account and try to extract meaning from it, try to understand what happened. Maybe they'll even go to the ridge and look at the bones and see if they can identify me among the arranged remains. But identification will miss the point. I won't be gone. I'll simply be everywhere in this forest, distributed across the root network and the canopy, aware and observing in ways that have no relation to human consciousness but will be, in their own way, more complete and more real than anything I've experienced before. The forest called, and I answered. That's the only truth that matters. My name is Kestrel. I know that sounds constructed, theatrical even, but it's the name my grandmother gave me during a family ceremony, and it stuck far better than my birth certificate ever did. I'm 34 years old, and I've worked for the National Forest Service for 7 seasons. This is my 8th. I took this assignment to disappear. The Appalachian region they assigned me to isn't technically a national park, it's part of the Jefferson National Forest, a sprawling expanse of ancient mountains worn down by time into something that looks almost gentle from the valleys. Don't let that fool you. The trees here are thick enough that noon looks like dusk. The ridgelines run north-south in patterns that confuse navigation, and the elevation changes fast enough to leave your lungs burning. People get lost here every season. Some of them we find. I accepted the posting because I needed to stop being found. My previous assignment, out west in Montana, had ended badly. Not catastrophically. No one died, no regulations were violated, but I'd made a decision that certain people questioned, and instead of defending myself, I requested transfer. The system is designed to accommodate such requests. Unprompted relocations suggest complications, so I let them think I was seeking a quieter position. The Appalachian Highlands seemed perfect for that story. My station is Blood Lake, which the Park Service officially calls Crescent Lake on all documents, but everyone local calls it by its older name. The lake isn't red, obviously. The name supposedly comes from the 1880s, something about a settlers' conflict that resulted in bodies left at the shore, or from the iron deposits in the surrounding rock. No one seems entirely certain anymore. Names persist regardless of whether we remember why they were given. The cabin sits on the eastern shore, roughly 60 acres of forest between me and the nearest hiking trail. The structure itself dates to 1952, a single-room ranger's station with a small kitchen area, a potbelly stove, and a cot that's been reinforced more times than I can count. The porch overlooks the lake, which on clear days reflects the ridgeline with unsettling precision. Sometimes I'd look at that reflection and forget which was real. I arrived in late August, when the days were still warm but the nights already hinted at what was coming. The truck that delivered my supplies left around sunset. The driver, a man named Vic whose family had worked these mountains for generations, shook my hand and said, "You'll get used to the quiet. Most people do." I didn't mention that quiet was exactly why I was here. My first week was administrative. I hiked the perimeter trails, checked the marking systems, inventoried emergency supplies, and set up a proper radio rotation schedule. The ranger station network operated on older equipment, UHF radios with patchy coverage in the valleys. I documented dead zones, tested backup procedures, and created a log. This work was rhythmic, comforting. Each task completed was a small achievement, proof that I was still capable of doing something right. The lake is roughly 2 miles from north to south, shaped like a crescent as the official name suggests. The water temperature stays cold even in late summer, something about the depth and the shade. The forest surrounding it is predominantly oak, hickory, and hemlock, with understory vegetation dense enough that moving more than a few feet off trail becomes genuinely difficult. I counted 17 established paths during that first month, though only 4 were maintained with any regularity. The solitude was everything I'd hoped for. I'd wake before dawn, spend hours patrolling, return to the cabin as afternoon light turned orange through the trees. I cooked simple meals, rice, beans, canned vegetables, and read by lamplight until I was tired enough to sleep. The work of maintenance, of being responsible for something concrete and unchanging, felt like a form of redemption. In early September, I found the first sign. I was walking the western ridge path, the one that connects to the broader trail system, when I noticed something on one of the hemlock trees. The bark was torn in a pattern I'd never seen before, not the parallel scratches of a black bear, which I'd documented dozens of times. These marks were deeper, more irregular, and they extended higher up the trunk than made sense. The claw spacing suggested something larger than anything native to the area. I photographed the tree with my ranger-issued camera and made a note in my logbook. I examined the surrounding area for scat or hair but found nothing. The weather had been dry, so the ground retained impressions well. I saw deer prints and coyote tracks, but nothing else remarkable. That evening I reported the finding to the main station downslope, the Asheville office 40 minutes away. A supervisor named Marcus asked me to describe the damage in detail. After I finished, there was a long pause. "Could be vandals," he finally said. "We get kids occasionally. They carve messages, try to damage the protected trees." "This wasn't a knife," I said. "The gouges are too deep and too irregular. Take another photo if you see it again. Keep documenting." Probably nothing. I didn't argue. Probably nothing was the statistical likelihood, and statistics don't require investigation. But I did pay closer attention after that. The second week of September brought the first real rain, a 3-day system that came from the west and stayed, the kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as persist, a constant pressure of moisture that soaks into everything. I stayed mostly inside, maintaining equipment and reorganizing supplies. The radio remained quiet except for automated check-ins. The forest outside the cabin windows became almost black, obscured by sheets of water. On the third night of rain, I heard something moving near the cabin. I was reading by the lamp in the main room when I heard it, not the sound of wind or water, but something heavier. A crashing, as if something large was pushing through the understory without care for stealth or efficiency. It moved from the northern side of the cabin toward the lake, and I heard the unmistakable sound of something entering the water. I extinguished my lamp immediately. In the darkness, I moved to the window, though the rain made seeing anything impossible. The sounds had stopped. I waited, heart actually accelerating in that way that's supposed to be metaphorical but wasn't. The rain continued its hiss and drum. The creek that fed into the cabin's water system seemed to be running higher, its distant roar more pronounced. By morning, the rain had stopped. The forest steamed. I immediately went to the area where I'd heard the sounds, looking for tracks in the mud. The ground was churned, but in a way that was difficult to parse, multiple impressions overlapping, depth inconsistent. I found evidence of something large having entered the lake, but whether that was from the previous night or days before, I couldn't determine. I told myself it was probably a bear, probably a large male, possibly a damaged specimen that had learned aggressive behavior in populated areas before being displaced. I told myself the irregular claw marks on the tree and the night movements were coincidental. The lake was very still that morning, its surface like dark glass, and I found myself avoiding looking at it directly. By late September, I couldn't maintain the fiction that individual observations were coincidental. The tree damage increased. I found 6 more marked hemlocks and 2 oaks, always within a mile of the cabin, always with that same irregular claw pattern. The marks were aging differently on each tree, some fresh enough that pale wood showed beneath the damaged bark, others already beginning to darken as they oxidized. The spacing suggested a consistent pattern of movement, as if whatever was making these marks had a route it followed, a circuit of the forest that brought it regularly to the same locations. I documented everything. Photographs, GPS coordinates, detailed written descriptions. I collected physical samples where possible, fibers caught on bark, minute fragments of claw if they were present. The samples I sent to the main office, where Marcus acknowledged receipt but expressed no particular concern. "Likely territorial marking," he said over the radio. "Males do this sometimes, especially in autumn. Nothing immediately dangerous." I didn't dispute this, but I didn't believe it either. In the third week of September, 2 hikers reported being lost on the eastern ridge. They'd started from the northern trailhead early that morning and had intended a loop hike, 8 miles total, completing before dark. By late afternoon, they hadn't checked in with the ranger station at the trailhead. By 6 p.m., the search protocol activated. I was the first responder. I took a flashlight, first aid supplies, and my radio, and moved into the forest with a deliberate pace. The eastern ridge wasn't difficult terrain, but darkness came early under the canopy. I moved slowly, announcing myself at intervals, listening for responses. They'd been hiking the main path but had apparently taken a side route toward a scenic overlook that I knew wasn't on the official trail system. Probably marked inadequately on whatever map they'd brought. Probably printed from an internet source that conflated official and unofficial routes. I found them less than a mile off the main path, sitting in a small clearing as the light failed completely. There was a woman, perhaps 50, and a man, perhaps 60. Both were soaked with sweat despite the cooling evening. The woman's eyes were very wide. "Thank God," the man said as he saw my flashlight. "We've been trying to get back for an hour. We couldn't find the trail again. It just disappeared." This happened regularly enough that I didn't find it particularly alarming. Trail navigation is a skill most casual hikers lack. I established their identities. Margaret was the woman, George was the man. They were from Charlotte, North Carolina. This was supposed to be an easy hike to celebrate their anniversary, and confirmed neither was injured. I handed Margaret a bottle of water and noted her breathing was rapid, slightly panicked. "We heard something," she said. "When we realized we were lost, we heard it moving in the forest." "Probably a deer," I said. "Maybe a bear. They're generally not aggressive if you give them space." "It didn't sound like a deer," Margaret said. "It sounded like something heavy moving through the trees, like something was following us." George placed his hand on her arm. "We got scared," he said to me. "Probably our imagination." I didn't respond to this. I got them back to the main trail and guided them back to the trailhead where the proper rangers were waiting with a vehicle. The whole process took 90 minutes. By the time I returned to the cabin, it was past midnight and I was moving on memory and reflex rather than actual alertness, but I made a note of Margaret's account. Following sounds. The sense of being tracked. In the final week of September, I found scat. It was positioned on the trail itself, roughly 2 miles north of the cabin, in the center of the path rather than on the side where animals typically leave evidence. This seemed deliberate to me, though I couldn't articulate why. The scat itself was unusual, clearly from a carnivore based on composition, but larger than any bear scat I'd encountered, and with a texture that seemed off somehow, though I had no frame of reference for correct texture. It contained fur and bone, but the bones were partially digested, which was normal. The fur, when I examined it closely, appeared to be deer. I photographed this too, and when I sent the image to Marcus with a detailed description, his response was slower than usual. When it came, his tone had changed. "Might be worth a wildlife survey," he said. "I'm going to contact the regional office. Don't enter the immediate area around that location without backup." This was new. Marcus had been dismissive before. I asked him what he thought I'd found. "Probably a displaced apex predator," he said. "A large cat or canine that shouldn't be in the area. Could be someone's escaped pet. Could be something that wandered from further west. We'll get an assessment." But he didn't say probably. He just said could be. October arrived with clear, cold mornings and afternoons that were genuinely warm. The forest entered its autumn peak, the dogwoods turning burgundy, the maples burning gold and red, the hickory nuts dropping in abundance. It was beautiful in a way that made the growing unease feel almost sacrilegious. The tree damage didn't stop. New marks appeared on trees I'd specifically noted and photographed, suggesting whatever was making them had returned multiple times. The pattern of damage seemed to be widening, expanding into areas I hadn't previously explored. I extended my patrol radius, spending entire days moving through the forest, documenting everything, and that's when I found the first evidence of a den. It was in a rocky outcropping roughly a mile northwest of the cabin, a space beneath the rock face that was large enough for something substantial to inhabit. The approach was worn, vegetation and leaf litter cleared away by repeated passage. At the mouth of the den, I found what appeared to be the remains of multiple kills. Bones, fur, a deer's skull with the antlers still attached. The bones had been there long enough to be clean, but not so long that they were brittle. This was an active site. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, the weight of what I was seeing pressing down. This was significant. This wasn't normal wildlife behavior, or if it was unusual enough to warrant proper investigation. I documented the location with GPS, photographed the site from multiple angles, and backed away slowly. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch with a flashlight and watched the lake, its surface barely visible in the darkness. I thought about Margaret's account of being followed. I thought about the size of the den. I thought about the pattern of the damage, spreading like something was claiming territory, demarcating it, announcing itself. I thought about the fact that I'd come here to disappear, and something else seemed to be disappearing too. The boundary between the explainable and something else entirely. The search and rescue call came on the 8th of October at approximately 3:15 p.m. 2 hikers, male and female, had started from the northern trailhead at dawn. They'd intended to complete a moderate loop hike and return by sunset. They had not checked in. Emergency protocols activated at 8 p.m. First response teams were organized, and I received the call from Marcus at 8:17. "Get to the trailhead," he said. "This one might be serious." I drove the station vehicle, a Jeep maintained specifically for ranger use, up the mountain road to the northern trailhead. It took 40 minutes. When I arrived, 2 other rangers were already there, a woman named Karen, who oversaw the northern section, and a man named Ridge, who was the SAR coordinator for the district. When did they check in? I asked. They didn't, Ridge said. That's the problem. The person who dropped them off this morning, the female hiker's sister, called to report them missing at 7:45 p.m. We've got a window of approximately 3 hours where we know they were hiking and not accounted for. Have you contacted them by satellite device? Not equipped, Ridge said. Standard hikers, basic GPS unit between them, both had phones that have zero signal out here. This was within normal parameters. I'd written the paperwork myself on why satellite devices should be recommended. The system didn't require them, and most casual hikers didn't invest in the equipment. Karen pulled up the file on the trail system. They were planning the East Ridge Circuit. 8 miles, moderate elevation, should take 4 to 5 hours depending on pace and photo stops. The route is well marked. I felt something in my stomach tighten. The East Ridge Circuit. The path where Margaret and George had gotten lost. The path that ran within a mile of my documented tree damage and scat findings. I'll take point on initial search, Ridge said. Karen, you coordinate base camp here. Kestrel, you work the secondary path. If they deviated, they'd likely end up in the ravines on the eastern side. I'll contact the county for additional resources. I could have told him about the scat. I could have told him about the den. I could have mentioned the pattern of evidence suggesting something large was moving through that exact area, but I didn't. The words formed and dissolved before they reached my mouth, and I've spent the subsequent months and years trying to understand why. I told myself that it was probably nothing. Statistically, lost hikers are found lost, not endangered. They get frightened, they sit down, they wait. They're discovered mostly unharmed. The probability that 2 people hiking on a well-marked trail would somehow encounter something dangerous was negligible. I lied to myself and said the professional thing to do was follow protocol. Protocol was search the secondary routes, cover the logical areas of deviation, assume human error rather than uncommon danger. But I knew the truth. And the truth was that I didn't speak up because I was afraid of what the response would be. I was afraid that if I reported what I'd found, it would create complications. They might close the hiking areas. They might send in teams with equipment and scrutiny. They might discover that I'd been documenting something genuinely unusual and ask questions about why I hadn't reported it sooner with more urgency. They might find out that I'd come to this place to disappear, and I'd end up leaving anyway. But this time with questions that followed me, so I didn't tell them. I took the secondary path into the ravines on the eastern side as instructed. The terrain there was steep and difficult, treacherous with loose rock. The light was failing rapidly. I moved carefully, shining my flashlight into crevices and calling out periodically. The ravines were empty. No sign of hikers, no evidence of recent passage, no response to my calls. I searched until full dark, which was around 7:45 p.m. at that latitude in early October. Then I returned to base camp and reported finding nothing. Ridge arrived back approximately 40 minutes later. He'd covered the Eastern Ridge Circuit itself and found evidence of recent passage, footprints on soft ground, disturbed vegetation, but the hikers weren't on the trail. He'd traced the path and found where they'd apparently left it, moving southeast away from the designated route. They deviated here, Ridge said, showing me the location on the map. Right about the midpoint of the circuit. My guess is they saw something that looked interesting, went off trail for photos, realized they couldn't retrace their steps, and got disoriented. I was nodding along, but the location he'd indicated was less than half a mile from the den I'd found. The search expanded overnight. By morning, there were 6 rangers and 4 county SR volunteers, plus a K-9 unit being transported from the regional office. By afternoon, there were more. The operation was growing, becoming more serious because the hikers still hadn't been found, and now the darkness was complete and the temperature was dropping toward freezing. I participated in the search. I moved through the areas I knew best, the routes I'd walked dozens of times, and I didn't find them. But on the 3rd day of searching, one of the county SAR volunteers found something. A piece of clothing, a fleece jacket, bright blue, torn in a way that suggested violence rather than normal wear and tear. It was located in the ravine system approximately 3/4 of a mile from where Ridge had found the deviation point. The jacket belonged to the male hiker. His name was Devon. The search pattern changed after that. It became more aggressive, more suspicious. They assumed foul play because the clothing suggested injury. They widened the perimeter. They brought in additional resources from neighboring counties, and they continued not to find either of the 2 hikers. On the 4th day, they found human remains. The discovery came in the early afternoon in the lower portion of the eastern ravine. What they found was partial. They found enough to identify the female hiker using dentals and personal effects. Her name was Rebecca. She was found in what the official report would later describe as remains consistent with scavenging by large predators. What they found was enough to rule out foul play by another human. It was not enough to explain what had killed her because the damage was extensive and severe in patterns that didn't match standard predation behavior. The coroner's report, which I wasn't technically supposed to read but which somehow made its way into my email, described wounds consistent with multiple attacks from an animal with considerable strength and unusual behavioral patterns. Devon was never found. The search was called off after 8 days. The state police became involved, which meant interviews and statements and careful documentation of what I'd observed and when. I told them about the tree damage, the scat, the den. I told them I'd documented findings but hadn't deemed them urgent enough to report with priority. I watched their faces, the particular set of the mouth that indicated they were assessing whether I'd committed some form of negligence. The official conclusion was that a large predator, most likely a displaced bear with abnormal aggression, or a big cat that had migrated from Western populations, was inhabiting the area. Rebecca's death was attributed to this predator. Devon's disappearance was attributed to the same animal, with the assumption that he either died and was consumed, or had wandered off injured and expired elsewhere in the wilderness. The management decision was to increase ranger presence and post warnings on the trailheads. They didn't close the hiking areas. They didn't recommend evacuation. They issued notices and proceeded with business. By mid-October, the emergency had become a statistic, and the forest was expected to return to baseline operations. But I couldn't return to baseline. The knowing had calcified into something permanent. I stopped hiking the areas where I'd found signs of the creature. I still performed ranger duties, but I restricted my movements to the lower elevations, the areas closer to the cabin and the lake. I kept the radio on constantly, afraid of being alone with the sound of the forest. I reinforced the cabin's door, checked the locks with obsessive frequency, and kept a knife and a rifle loaded and accessible at all times. The fear was the thing that ate at me most. Not the creature itself, which I'd never directly encountered, but the knowledge of its presence and my own helplessness in its proximity. October folded into November. The weather turned cold. The foliage dropped away, leaving the forest increasingly bare and exposed. Without the leaf cover, the landscape seemed larger and emptier. The trails became more visible from multiple angles, but that visibility didn't comfort me. It just meant there was more space between me and anything approaching. I found more tree damage in November. More scat. Evidence suggesting the creature was still active, still moving through the territory, still following its routes. The den remained active. Once, in mid-November, I heard something at the lake's edge late at night, a sound like something drinking or moving through the water. I didn't investigate. Marcus called in early November and asked how I was holding up. "I'm managing," I said. "Look," he said, and there was a hesitation in his voice that I recognized as sympathy. Rebecca's death, that was unusual. I've seen wildlife attacks. This wasn't standard, but it's also not something we can definitively address through normal channels. The state is satisfied it was a predator attack. The area is posted. You've done your job documenting the situation. If you want to transfer, I can support that. I considered it. I thought about leaving, about going somewhere new where I didn't know the patterns of a predator I'd helped define through documentation. But leaving felt like admission. It felt like the creature had driven me away, which was closer to the truth than I wanted to acknowledge. "I'm staying," I said. "All right," Marcus said. "Just be careful." In mid-November, I found something that changed the nature of my understanding. I was patrolling the western ridge path, the one where I'd first documented the claw marks, and I found something unusual in the soil beside the path. It was disturbed earth, as if something had been digging and the soil was still damp, suggesting the disturbance was recent. I began carefully excavating around the area and found bones, human bones. The skeleton was not whole. It was disarticulated and scattered across an area of roughly 2 feet. The remains were partially degraded, but not so degraded that they were skeletal dust. The estimate, based on the decay pattern, suggested these bones had been in the soil for somewhere between 1 and 2 years. I stopped excavating immediately and contacted Marcus. What followed was a professional excavation by forensic specialists. They documented the site, recovered the bones with proper technique, and submitted them for analysis. The bones belonged to a man who'd been reported missing in September of the previous year. His name was Julian, and he'd been a hiker who set out alone from a trailhead in the northern section and never returned. The official cause of death was ruled undetermined. The state police investigated whether foul play was involved, but the scattered nature of the remains, combined with the presence of animal damage to the bones, made it impossible to determine whether human action had preceded the animal scavenging. But I understood what it meant. It meant the creature had been in this area for at least 2 years, possibly longer. It meant Rebecca and Devon weren't the first casualties. It meant that the trail system had been active in the territories of something that considered itself a predator with human-shaped prey. That knowledge was the worst part. Not fear of what might happen, but certainty that it had already happened multiple times, and that knowledge had been dispersed and lost and fragmented across missing persons reports and search operations that had failed to connect the pattern. I spent the rest of November and most of December in a state that bordered on paranoia, though I'd have argued that it was justified vigilance rather than paranoia. I documented every sign obsessively. I analyzed patterns of movement. I created mental maps of where the creature traveled and when. I identified what seemed to be a primary range, the area encompassing the West Ridge, the eastern ravines, and a belt of forest that ran roughly north-south through the center of the territory. The creature seemed to move primarily at night, though there were daylight sightings reported by hikers and rangers, usually in the form of something glimpsed briefly that didn't fit easily into known categories. A shape in the trees, something large moving between the distant ridges, nothing that could be documented with certainty, but numerous enough to suggest pattern. By December, the forest had become something foreign. The landscape I'd walked for 4 months had transformed into a maze that I knew intellectually but couldn't inhabit with any sense of safety. The cabin, which had been a refuge, became a shelter, a place I returned to each night as a necessity rather than a comfort. I started having the dreams around mid-December. They weren't nightmares exactly. They were dreams where I'd be walking a forest path and I'd realize, gradually and with mounting horror, that something was moving parallel to me. Not chasing, not hunting, just moving in the same direction. Always just beyond visibility, always present. And then the dream would shift and I'd understand that the creature wasn't running from something, it was something and I was the thing it was aware of. I'd wake from these dreams with my heart rate elevated and my breathing shallow, and I'd sit in the darkness of the cabin and listen to the forest with complete attention. On the 15th of December, I encountered it. I was 3 miles north of the cabin, following one of the secondary trail routes, when I felt the atmospheric pressure shift. I stopped walking. The forest around me was very quiet. The kind of quiet that indicates presence rather than absence. Something large was nearby, and every animal in the immediate vicinity was hiding. I stood completely still. My hand moved to the knife on my belt, though I understood on a cellular level that a knife would be useless. My breath formed clouds in the cold air. I could smell something then, something acrid and unpleasant, carried on a small breeze, and then I saw it. It was approximately 50 yards away, partially obscured by the trees, but visible enough that I could make out form and detail. The creature was larger than I'd expected. The head reached approximately 8 feet up the trunk of a hickory tree. The body was covered in dark fur, matted and dense. The shape was wrong though, and that wrongness was worse than the size. The proportions didn't match any animal I could reference. The way it moved wasn't a walk or a lope, but something that suggested structure and joints working in coordination that seemed inappropriate for what it was. And then it looked at me. I don't know how to describe the act of being recognized by something truly wild and potentially predatory. It wasn't a moment of connection. It was a moment of being categorized, assessed as a potential threat or resource or other. The eyes were dark, and they held intelligence that was unsettling in a way I still can't articulate clearly. The creature watched me. I watched it, and in that silence, stretched and elastic, was a communication that existed beneath language. It was an acknowledgement. It knew I was here. I knew it was here. The boundary between observer and observed had collapsed. Then it turned and moved back into the forest, not running, just walking away with the same loping gait, and within seconds it was gone. I didn't move for 5 minutes. Then I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the space where it had disappeared. Once I was a reasonable distance back, I turned and walked rapidly toward the cabin. I didn't go to the forest for the rest of December. I radioed in my daily status reports but didn't leave the immediate vicinity of the cabin and the lake. I watched the calendar and waited for the end of the year as if the calendar had some significance beyond human convention, as if December 31st would represent a boundary that meant something to the creature as well. On December 30th, I contacted Marcus and told him I was requesting a transfer effective immediately. "I can have that processed," he said. "But I need to know if something's happened." "No," I said. I just need to leave. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. Did you encounter the animal? I don't want to discuss it, I said. Kestrel, I need to know if you encountered it. I know it's in the forest, I said. I know it's been there. I know what it is, or I know enough about what it is to understand that I don't need to stay. The final week of December, I packed my belongings. A truck came to collect me on January 2nd. The driver was the same man, Vic, who'd brought me to the cabin 6 months earlier. He didn't ask questions about my early departure, which suggested he'd been briefed. As we drove away from Blood Lake, I looked back one final time. The forest was gray-green under the winter light, the lake visible through the bare trees, the cabin small and isolated on the shore. I thought about the creature moving through those woods, following its roots, hunting its territory, existing in the space between known nature and something the authorities couldn't officially acknowledge. I quit the ranger service entirely in February. I couldn't articulate to administrators why I no longer felt safe in wilderness areas, so I simply said that my interests had changed. I work in administrative positions now, at a desk, with controlled environments and clear boundaries. I see news occasionally about missing hikers in the Appalachian region. I note the patterns, but I don't report them. Some knowledge once acquired is impossible to forget, but also impossible to meaningfully communicate. The forest remembers, though. Blood Lake, with its dark water and its shores lined with marked trees, remembers. And somewhere in those mountains, moving through the territories it's claimed, is something that moves between the spaces that humans can map. It knows where the trails are. It knows where people go. And it waits in the deep shadows between the ridges where the topography makes sight difficult and escape problematic. I was right to leave. But I was also wrong, because leaving doesn't actually change anything. The creature is still there, and people are still going into those woods, and the pattern continues because the forest doesn't care about our maps or our designations or our need for official explanations. Some wilderness is not meant to be inhabited, even by those of us brave enough to attempt it. My name is Dakota Mason, and I've been the ranger at Ridge Lake Station for 17 months. When the Forest Service recruited me, they didn't know I was running from something. They just saw my credentials. 10 years with the Park Service, clean record, wilderness survival certifications. They saw a man who belonged in the high places where civilization barely reaches. The truth was darker. I needed to disappear. I was living in Kentucky then, managing a routine post in a developed forest where the biggest problem was weekend campers leaving trash and teenagers racing ATVs through protected zones. The pay was adequate, the work was mindless, and the loneliness was comfortable. It kept me from thinking about my ex-wife, about the custody arrangement that left me seeing my daughter every other weekend, about the general wreckage of trying to be two places at once and succeeding at neither. When the Ridge Lake position opened, the job posting was almost an afterthought on the internal bulletin board. Remote research station, Appalachian National Forest, minimal human contact, 1-year contract with renewal contingent on performance. The cabin had no cell service, spotty radio contact, and supply runs came once monthly unless weather prevented it. To most rangers, it sounded like punishment. To me, it sounded like mercy. The station sits on the eastern slope of the ridge, facing a wilderness that hasn't changed much since the 1800s. Hemlocks and red spruce tower over a valley floor thick with mountain laurel and rhododendron. The lake, actually a reservoir created in 1987, though locals still call it Ridge Lake, stretches for nearly 2 miles, cold and deep and bordered by cliffs on the far side. The cabin was built in 1993, a sturdy structure of stone and timber that had weathered dozens of winters. Solar panels and a backup generator provided power, a well-supplied water. It was more self-sufficient than most human beings. The job itself was straightforward. Monitor wildlife populations, maintain the trail system, conduct vegetation surveys, manage the small research station that housed visiting biologists twice a year. I would spend most days alone, walking the ridges with a GPS unit and a notebook, counting deer and turkey, measuring forest health, recording what the woods wanted to tell me. I arrived in late August, and the forest was already preparing for the transition. Days were still warm, but the shadows came earlier now. The light had changed, becoming more horizontal, touching everything with amber before surrendering to dusk. The cabin sat empty and waiting, its windows dark. The drive from the nearest town, Millspur, population 1,200, takes 4 hours on good roads, then another 90 minutes on increasingly narrow Forest Service roads. The last 20 minutes, you're basically following what amounts to a cleared hiking trail. When I came around the final bend and saw the cabin, Something in my chest unknotted. This could work, I thought. This could be enough. The first week, I inventoried everything. The equipment stored in the equipment shed, the trail maps and wildlife surveys in the office, the emergency protocols and radio procedures. The previous ranger, a man named Garrett who took a job in Colorado, had left detailed notes about patterns, problem areas, seasonal concerns. One note, written in the margins of the trail maintenance log, caught my attention. Late October to early March. Keep perimeter clear. Wildlife gets unpredictable. Recommend reinforcing cabin doors Slensto before November. Under that, in smaller handwriting. Seriously. This region has old problems. I marked it down but didn't think much about it then. Every remote forest post has superstitions and folklore. Rangers working in isolation develop their own mythologies to explain the sounds the woods make at night. August was magnificent. The lake in late afternoon was like dark glass, and the trails were clear and welcoming. I fell into a rhythm. Up at 6, coffee in the cabin's small kitchen while checking the radio for any overnight reports, then out into the forest for surveys and trail maintenance. I'd return around 4, process my data, prepare a simple dinner, and spend the evening reading or sitting on the porch watching the light drain from the valley. I called my daughter twice that first month. My ex-wife answered once, brief and professional. The other time I reached Mira directly. She was 12. Reluctant to talk about anything substantive. My life as a father had become constrained to scheduled moments and forced interest in school events that happened states away. I'm in the mountains, I told her, trying to make it sound like an adventure rather than what it was, an escape. That's nice, Dad, she said with the patient kindness of a child who loves you out of obligation. After those calls, I'd sit for hours, watching the woods darken, feeling the weight of the things I'd left behind and the things that would never change. By September, I had established most of the basic trails. The Forest Service maintains 12 major trails through the wilderness around Ridge Lake, ranging from the 3-mile loop at the base to the 17-mile ridge traverse that took 2 days. I was responsible for clearing, marking, and making sure water crossings were safe. It was methodical work, the kind that required your mind but didn't demand it. That's when I started noticing the silence, not the normal forest silence. The kind of quiet you get when the machinery of civilization shuts down and you hear birds, wind, water, the settling of the land. That kind of silence is peaceful. What I noticed was different. Moments where even that background noise seemed to pause, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. These moments would last 10 or 20 seconds. During them, I'd stop and listen, and there would be nothing. No birds, no rustling, no wind. Just the sound of my own breathing and the feeling that something had noticed me noticing it. The first time it happened, I was alone on the Upper Ridge Trail, perhaps 5 miles from the cabin. I was marking deteriorated blazes and hadn't been paying particular attention to anything except the work. I cut a fresh blaze into a hemlock, stepped back to admire it, and the forest went silent. I waited, thinking something had startled nearby deer or turkey, and they'd alerted the surrounding animals, but nothing emerged. The silence extended. 30 seconds, a minute. I stood there on the narrow trail, hemmed in by dense understory, with absolutely nothing visible in any direction except trees and more trees. Then, just as suddenly, a Carolina wren called out, sharp and piercing. Birds resumed their afternoon conversations. The normal sounds of autumn forest returned. I told myself it was nothing. Forests do that sometimes. Animals move, birds flock, momentary silences occur. But I started paying attention, and I started noticing it happening more frequently. Maybe once every 3 days, always without warning. Always that same quality of listening, of the world pausing, and always it seemed to happen when I was alone on the trails, away from the cabin. By mid-October, I had my field seasons mostly planned. The late autumn surveys for ruffed grouse and black bear, the winter monitoring stations, the spring wildflower documentation. The work was solid and real, and it required my focus. I was beginning to believe I might actually accomplish something here, might actually be useful for once. Then the hikers started arriving. They'd been coming all along, of course. The public trails around Ridge Lake are maintained specifically for recreation. But by October, most of the casual weekend hikers from the nearby towns were gone, replaced by more serious wilderness people. People who wanted the challenge of the ridges, who brought proper gear and maps, who were genuinely equipped to be in the backcountry. Most of them passed through without incident. I'd encounter them on the trails, exchange pleasantries, answer questions about conditions. I'd note them in my daily log. Part of the job included rough estimates of trail usage, but one group gave me pause. They appeared on the Upper Ridge Trail in mid-October, and I met them coming down as I was heading up. 5 of them, 2 men, 3 women, all in their 20s or 30s, all competently equipped. They were moving cautiously, which was appropriate for the ridge terrain, and they looked alert and aware. In daylight, on established trails, they seemed entirely fine. But when we passed, one of the men, dark-haired, with the kind of intensity that comes from focused, intelligent observation, asked me something that stuck with me. Has anyone reported unusual sounds out here, like vocalizations? I asked him what kind of sounds. We're not sure, one of the women answered. She was studying my face with more attention than the question seemed to warrant. We're doing a wildlife survey, independent research. We're interested in anything unusual, animals calling at odd hours, patterns that don't match standard behaviors. I told them no, nothing like that. I asked what specifically they were studying. They were vague. General wildlife ecology, animal behavior documentation, nothing invasive. I gave them my contact information at the station in case they found anything interesting, and they thanked me and moved on. I watched them go, and I had that feeling again, that the forest was paying attention, that something had noticed this exchange and was waiting to see what would come next. That night, I made radio contact with the main station at Asheville. I asked casually about independent researchers in my zone. The dispatcher, a woman named Curtis, said that independent surveys were registered through the Forest Service and they should have permits. She'd check and get back to me. She never did. By the time early November arrived, I had stopped wondering about the hikers and started acknowledging what I'd been pretending not to notice about my own situation. I was afraid, not of anything specific. That would have been manageable. This was the particular fear of someone who knows something is wrong but can't articulate what. The forest had shifted from peaceful isolation to something else. The silences had become more frequent and longer. I'd started seeing places where trees had been stripped of bark at heights that made no sense for deer. Tracks in the soft soil around the lake that I couldn't immediately identify. Too large to be human, wrong shape for bear or elk. And the sounds at night. The cabin was well insulated, but I'd begun to hear noises that pulled me from sleep. Not the typical forest sounds. These were different. Something large moving through the understory. Something that didn't stay in one place. On November 3rd, I called my supervisor in Asheville. I didn't mention my unease. That would have sounded unprofessional, like the isolation was affecting me. Instead, I asked about the hikers again, whether there were any permits on file for independent research in my zone. There weren't. He said he'd look into it, but his tone made it clear he wasn't very concerned. Hikers sometimes skipped permits. It was common. Just keep an eye on the trails, he said. Make sure nothing gets damaged, and let me know if you need anything out there. I didn't tell him that what I needed was permission to leave, that what I needed was to be back in civilization, back around people, back where the night air didn't sound like it was breathing. That was when I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The forest that had promised isolation and peace had delivered something far more complicated. The realization that the silence and solitude that had drawn me could become unbearable once the world itself seemed to turn against your presence in it. The first week of November brought the first real cold. Temperatures dropped into the 20s at night, and frost coated the cabin windows in elaborate patterns. I spent an entire day winterizing the station, sealing gaps, checking the generator, stocking firewood from the previous ranger's supply. Garrett's note about reinforcing doors and windows echoed in my mind, so I added extra bolts to both. The hikers returned on November 8th. I was working on the trail system near the lake when I encountered them again, same group of 5, moving in the opposite direction. They looked different this time, tired. Their gear was more heavily laden, suggesting they'd been in the field longer than I'd realized. But more than that, they looked frightened, though they seemed to be trying not to show it. The dark-haired man, I still didn't know his name, nodded to me and kept moving. But one of the women broke formation and approached me directly. "Has anything unusual happened at your station?" she asked quietly, away from the others. I asked her what she meant. Anything missing? Any signs of disturbance? Any sense that something was present that shouldn't have been? There was something in her voice that made this real. Not speculative. Not the abstract concern of a researcher. Genuine worry about a specific threat. I lied and said no, everything was fine. "If something does happen," she said, and she spoke low enough that the others couldn't hear, "document everything, the exact time, the precise location, what the signs were. If you see something, don't approach it. Contact the main station and stay indoors. Do you understand?" I asked her what I should be looking for. She looked like she wanted to tell me. Her mouth opened, closed. She glanced back at her group, and whatever she'd been about to say died unspoken. "Just be careful," she finally said. "This area has a problem." Then she turned and walked back to her group, and they continued down the trail at a pace that was faster than was safe given the terrain. Within minutes, they were gone and I was alone with the echo of her warning. The problem, I spent the rest of that day thinking about what she might mean. By the time I returned to the cabin, I'd convinced myself it was probably something mundane. Maybe they'd had an encounter with an aggressive bear, or one of them had gotten injured and they were concerned about the danger of the remote location. The warning about documenting signs and staying indoors could mean lots of things, but I documented it anyway. I recorded the encounter in my daily log, noting the time, location, and the content of our conversation. And I started paying closer attention to the perimeter of the cabin and the trails immediately around it. That was when I started finding the evidence. The first sign was subtle, a pattern in the snow and frost near the equipment shed. Something had walked there multiple times. Tracks overlapped and confused, making it impossible to discern a single clear print. But the pattern suggested something large and bipedal, moving in a way that circled the shed deliberately, as if examining it. The tracks were deeper on one side, more pressure, more weight, which didn't align with how any four-legged animal would move. I took photographs with my field camera, measurements with my tape measure. The stride length was nearly 4 feet. The depth suggested something weighing at least 200 pounds, maybe more. I found similar patterns near the cabin's back door. Whatever was making these marks had visited both structures multiple times. The patterns suggested deliberate investigation rather than random wandering. That night I made coffee at 3 in the morning instead of trying to sleep. I sat in the cabin with all the lights on, listening to the darkness outside and trying to decide if I was losing my mind. The woman's warning kept repeating, "Don't approach it, stay indoors, document everything." The next morning I radioed my supervisor again and reported damage to the equipment shed. Not damage exactly, but signs of disturbance, possible attempted entry. He said to file the proper report, and if the problem persisted, someone would come out to investigate. The tone suggested he'd heard similar reports before and wasn't particularly alarmed. "What kind of damage?" he asked. I couldn't articulate what I'd found without sounding paranoid. "Evidence of something trying to access the structure," I finally said. "Large animal, possibly aggressive." A pause on the other end. Then, "Bear?" That was the obvious answer. Late autumn. A bear seeking shelter or last-minute calories before hibernation. It made sense. "Possibly," I said, but I knew it wasn't a bear. The pattern of the tracks, the deliberate quality of the investigation, it was something else. By mid-November, the frequency of the signs had increased dramatically. I found evidence of the creature in different parts of the perimeter. Scratch marks on the cabin's exterior walls, too high to be bare. A deadfall tree moved to the edge of the clearing, not pushed by weather but deliberately positioned. Scat that I couldn't identify, deposited almost ceremonially at the end of the upper trail, right at the boundary of my maintained trail system. And the sounds had intensified. They were no longer distant or ambiguous. They were present and close, often late at night. Long vocalizations that seemed to combine elements of animal sounds without matching anything I could name. Sometimes they sounded almost human, a kind of keening or wailing that made my skin crawl. Other times they were guttural, aggressive, the sound of something large and powerful communicating in its own language. I took recordings on my field camera, audio only. I documented everything with dates and times. I marked a map with locations where I'd found evidence. The pattern became undeniable. Something was mapping the cabin, learning its structure, its entrances, the rhythms of my presence. On November 16th, I found a dead deer at the edge of the clearing. It had been killed recently, within the last day or two. The method was what got my attention. Most predators kill and feed, and the remains show it. This deer had been opened with precision, organs removed, the meat untouched. It had been arranged, almost deliberately, facing toward the cabin. The message, if there was one, was clear. "I know what you are, and I know where you are." That afternoon, I made the call I should have made days earlier. "I need extraction," I told my supervisor. "I believe there's an animal on the station that poses a threat to my safety. I want to leave." There was a very long pause. "The ranger before you managed without incident," he finally said. "I don't care. I'm asking for removal. Either you get me out, or I walk out." Another pause. I could almost hear him calculating the paperwork involved in an early termination, the questions it would raise, the implication that something was wrong with the station itself. "I'll schedule a pickup," he said. "Supply run is in 6 days. You can come out then." 6 days. I asked if he could make it sooner. He said the next scheduled trip to my area was 6 days out, and accelerating it would require authorization from his supervisor and a significant cost justification. What exactly was the threat? I almost told him. I almost explained about the tracks, the dead deer, the sounds that didn't match any known animal in Appalachia, but I knew what he'd say. "Ranger, you're isolated. It's dark in November. Remote posts affect judgment. Come out on the scheduled run. There's no actual threat." 6 days, I confirmed. 6 days, he confirmed. "Stay calm. Lock up. You're safe in the cabin." After that call, I prepared in methodical detail. I reinforced the windows with boards I found in the equipment shed. I moved all the food and water inside the cabin and created supplies in different rooms, in case I needed to move to another part of the structure. I set up a lighting system powered by the generator so I could illuminate the perimeter if needed. I made sure every door and window was secured, and I waited. On the night of November 18th, the creature came directly to the cabin. I was sitting in the main room, lights on, trying to read but mostly just staring at the pages. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. Large, bipedal, circling the cabin with clear intent rather than idle curiosity. I went to the window, reinforced now, but still transparent, and looked out. I couldn't see it, not clearly. The night was moonless and starless, and the forest extended beyond the reach of the cabin's exterior lights. But I could hear it, breathing hard, like it had been running, movements that suggested massive size, powerful musculature, purposeful behavior. It was testing the doors. I heard the handles. I heard the weight against the reinforced entries. I heard something that might have been frustration, a sound between a growl and a roar that echoed across the open ground around the cabin. For perhaps 30 minutes it circled, testing, searching for a way in. I stood in the center of the main room, lights blazing, generator running loud enough to cover any sound I might have made, and I listened to something I couldn't name try to enter the space where I lived. Then it was gone. The sound stopped. The terrible attention that had been focused on the cabin dissipated, and the forest went back to its normal night sounds. I didn't sleep. I sat through the rest of the darkness with a flashlight and my field notebook, documenting everything I could remember about the sounds, the movements, the sequence of events. My hands shook as I wrote. When dawn came, I found new evidence on the porch. Deliberate scratchings on the reinforced door, marks that suggested the creature had used its hands or manipulated the space intentionally, not the random gouging of an animal. And there was something else, a smell, thick and wrong, that lingered in the cold air, like meat left in the sun too long, mixed with something acrid and chemical that made my stomach tighten. I spent that day moving supplies into the cabin's back room, creating what amounted to a refuge room within the larger shelter. If the creature managed to breach the main structure, I could seal myself behind the interior door, reinforced, with locks and a backup window for emergency exit. I had water, food, blankets, first aid supplies, and my satellite messenger device. The device was my lifeline. The station had minimal cell service, but I'd purchased a satellite communicator before arriving, something that could send messages to emergency services via satellite if everything else failed. It had seemed like excessive caution at the time. Now it felt like the only thing standing between me and oblivion. That night, the creature returned. The creature came again on the 19th, the 20th, the 21st. Each night the pattern was similar: arrival around 2 in the morning, methodical testing of doors and windows, frustrated vocalizations when it found them secure, and then withdrawal as dawn approached. Each time new evidence appeared: deeper scratches on the doors, marks on the walls, the smell that now seemed to linger permanently in the air around the cabin. But something changed on the 22nd. That night it didn't try to enter. Instead, it sat somewhere in the darkness beyond my lights, and it called. Not attacking, not testing, just calling, over and over. A sound that was almost like speech, like something trying to form words in a throat not designed for language. Long, keening vocalizations that seemed to carry intention and meaning, even though I couldn't parse what they meant. I sat in the refuge room and recorded every sound, every inflection. And I listened, really listened, to what it was trying to express. There was something in those calls that wasn't pure animal. There was something almost like loneliness, or hunger, or a kind of desperate communication. Around 4 in the morning, the call stopped. When dawn came, there was no sign that the creature had moved closer. It had simply sat in the dark and vocalized for hours, as if trying to reach me. That was when I realized the hiker's woman had been wrong about one thing. This creature wasn't simply a threat to be avoided. It was intelligent. It was trying to communicate. The recognition terrified me more than the attacks had. On November 23rd, Supply Day was theoretically 2 days away. I'd been told they'd arrive by the afternoon of the 25th. 72 hours. I could hear the calculation in my mind. The creature had been escalating for 5 days. If the pattern continued to intensify at the current rate, what would happen by the time the supply run arrived? Would there even be a cabin left? Would there be anything of me left to evacuate? That morning I did something that I'd been building toward but hadn't quite admitted to myself. I took the rifle from the equipment shed. It was a standard-issue wildlife management rifle, kept for situations where problem animals needed to be dealt with. It was loaded, secured, and I knew how to use it. I'd qualified on similar weapons in ranger training years ago. I brought the rifle into the cabin and loaded it with ammunition. I positioned it within easy reach in the refuge room, and I sat with the full weight of what I'd done. If the creature managed to breach the structure, if it actually entered the cabin, I would have seconds to make a decision that would define the rest of my life, if I lived. That afternoon, something unusual happened. The hikers appeared at the cabin, all 5 of them, approaching in daylight, moving quickly. I saw them from the window and went out to meet them, rifle in hand. The dark-haired man put his hands up immediately. "We're not a threat," he said. "We came to warn you. We're leaving the area, and you should too." I asked them what they knew. The woman who'd warned me before stepped forward. "That thing has been in this region for at least 5 years. We know because we've been tracking it. Our research isn't independent. We're contracted by a private institute that studies cryptid populations. We've been documenting its range, its behavior, its patterns." I asked her what it was. "We don't know," she admitted. "Not exactly. The indigenous populations call it a Wendigo, but that's a term from further north, from Algonquin territory. Here, in Appalachia, it has different names, old names, the kind of names that don't get written down much anymore. But the descriptions match. Humanoid, bipedal, intelligent enough to problem solve, predatory in nature, and profoundly dangerous when it becomes fixated on a location or a person." The other man interrupted. "This area has a long history. The lake is relatively new, 1987. But before that, this valley had a different reputation. There were incidents in the 1960s and the 1920s going back at least 100 years. People went missing. Entire families disappeared. The official explanations were always mundane: relocation, economic hardship, getting lost in the woods. But if you look at the patterns, at the clusters of disappearances in specific seasons and specific locations," he trailed off, but I understood. Patterns suggested predation. Regular patterns suggested something intelligent and territorial. "Why didn't someone tell me?" I demanded. "We tried," the woman said. "That's why I warned you on the trail. But the Forest Service doesn't acknowledge the problem. It would create liability, would scare off visitors, would require federal investigation and resources they don't want to allocate. It's easier to hire rangers and hope they either deal with it quietly or leave quietly." I asked her the real question. "Why is it fixated on me?" "Probably because you're alone," she said, and I heard the pity in her voice. "These creatures, they hunt in patterns, but they also hunt opportunity. A solitary human in a remote location separated from help. It's exactly what they're adapted to exploit. If you'd been part of a larger group, you wouldn't interest it, but you're alone, and it knows it." I lowered the rifle. "What do I do? Leave? Tonight. Don't wait for the supply run. Take what you can carry and walk out. The main road is about 20 miles south. It'll take 6 to 8 hours of hard walking, but you could be in Millspur by dawn." I shook my head. "The trails at night, alone, with that thing out there?" "The thing will follow you either way," the dark-haired man said quietly. "But on the trail, moving, you have momentum. It's drawn to stationary targets, to people who stay in one place. If you keep moving, keep making progress towards civilization, you have a chance." They argued for another 10 minutes, trying to convince me. But I could see the fear in them, the urgency that suggested they were barely in control of their own survival instinct. They were leaving tonight, they said. They'd come to give me the warning they'd wanted to give the ranger before me, but no one had believed them. They'd failed. But they could at least try to save me. When they finally left, they left because I refused to go with them. They'd made their attempt at rescue, and I'd chosen isolation over desperate flight. I watched them disappear down the trail toward whatever extraction point they'd arranged with their institute, and then I was alone again. That night, the creature didn't come to the cabin. Instead, I heard it in the forest, larger and more aggressive sounds. and I realized it was hunting the hikers. It had picked up their scent, their presence, and it was pursuing them with a focus that made their warning seem suddenly very real. I heard one scream around midnight. Just one, cut short. I locked myself in the refuge room and didn't sleep. By dawn on the 24th, the forest was quiet again. The hikers were gone, probably dead, probably integrated into the creature's feeding cycle. The supply run was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. 24 hours. I sat in the cabin and wondered about Garrett, the previous ranger. His note about keeping the perimeter clear, about the region having old problems. Had he encountered the creature? Had he left because of it, framing his departure as a simple job transfer? Or had something worse happened to him and the paperwork processed normally, and no one questioned it too closely? That night, the creature returned to the cabin, and it was different. Angrier, more aggressive. It hit the doors with force that I could feel through the entire structure. It clawed at the walls with a kind of furious desperation, as if whatever had been restraining its violence before had finally broken. I sat in the refuge room with the rifle loaded, and I listened to my shelter being tested by something that was no longer bothering with subtlety. Around 3 in the morning, something gave. I heard it from the main room, a window frame cracking, not completely breached but compromised. I stood, raised the rifle, and faced the refuge room door. If the creature made it through the compromised window, if it found its way to my location, I would have seconds to react. I centered myself, made the calculations, steadied my breathing. The sounds in the main room intensified, something large moving, searching. The smell intensified, that meat and chemical reek that made my throat close. I could hear it breathing, heavy and wet and wrong. Then it found the interior door to the refuge room, and it began to work at that too. I raised the rifle. I sighted on the point where the door would open. I placed my finger on the trigger, and the creature stopped, not suddenly, gradually. The sounds decreased. The pressure on the door eased. I heard it moving back toward the main room, heard the crunching of something beneath its feet. Then, silence. I waited for an hour without moving. When I finally opened the refuge room door, the cabin was empty. The compromised window had allowed entry, but the creature had left. What it had been searching for, it apparently had not found, or perhaps it had found something else. In the main room, I discovered what had distracted it. One of my supply boxes had been torn open. The creature had taken the food, salt, preserved meat, various emergency supplies. It had taken what it came for, or perhaps it had found something that smelled like what it wanted. The supply run arrived at 3 in the afternoon on November 25th. The driver was a man named Roy who'd been making supply runs to remote stations for 15 years. He took one look at the cabin and asked what had happened. I didn't know how to answer. I couldn't explain the tracks, the creature, the hikers, the escalating violence. There was no external evidence that was convincing. The window damage could be attributed to weather or wildlife. The scratches and marks were vague. What I said was, I need to leave. Personal reasons. I'm not suited for this post. Roy accepted that without judgment. He'd seen rangers break before. Isolation did that to people sometimes, especially the ones who came to the wilderness running from something else. He helped me pack. He didn't ask about the rifle I was loading into the truck, though his eyes registered it. As we drove away from Ridge Lake Station, I watched the cabin recede in the side mirror. I thought about Garrett, about the hikers, about all the people who disappeared in this valley over the course of a century. And I wondered what would happen now that I was leaving, now that the creature would have to adapt to the loss of its recent fixation. Would it return to the periodic feeding that had sustained it for generations? Would it search for the next solitary ranger, the next isolated human in the wrong place at the wrong time? Would it be satisfied with whatever fragments of the hikers it had consumed, or would it hunger again soon, adapting its patterns to continue the cycle that had made this land a kind of hunting preserve for something that the maps refused to name? I never found out what killed the hikers. I never saw the creature. I never had to fire the rifle. I survived by running, by choosing the option that was presented to me, and by the accident of timing that brought the supply truck a day early. But I know what lived in that valley, not a legend, not a myth. Something real enough to leave tracks, to test doors, to plan and communicate and hunt. Something that understood the rhythms of human behavior well enough to exploit them. And somewhere in the Appalachian wilderness, it's still there, in the places where the maps are blank and the trails end and the forest belongs more to what's wild than to what's managed. I never went back to the Forest Service. I couldn't be trusted with remote posts anymore, couldn't function in isolation. I'm working for a private security firm now. Day shifts in a building with people everywhere, lights that never dim. My ex-wife was kind enough to increase my visitation time with Mira. I see my daughter more regularly, and I'm trying to be present in her life, trying to be the kind of father who stays in the world rather than running from it. But every fall, as October turns to November, I feel it, the pull of the isolation, the hunger for the solitude I ran from. And I remember what the woman said. It's drawn to stationary targets. It hunts the ones who stay in one place. So I keep moving. I stay in the world, stay among people, stay in the light, because the alternative, the endless silence broken only by the sounds of something large and intelligent in the dark, is something I understand now with perfect clarity. That's not peace. That's just a different kind of predation. And prey, if it's smart enough, learns to run. The drive out took 6 hours instead of 4. Roy drove slowly on the narrower forest roads, taking the curves with practiced caution. I sat in the passenger seat and tried not to think about the window I'd reinforced, the compromise I'd allowed to fester until the threshold between safety and violation became permeable. Roy didn't try to make conversation. He was a professional in the way old-school workers are, understanding that silence during transitions is more respectful than forced cheerfulness. Somewhere around mile marker 40, he asked if I wanted to stop for food. I said no. My stomach was tight, my mouth dry, and the thought of eating was impossible. We reached Millspur just after 9 in the evening. Roy drove to the Forest Service regional office and watched while I checked out. My supervisor, not the one I'd spoken to on the radio, but his boss, a woman named Hendricks, asked me to write up a report on why I was terminating early. Personal reasons, I said. She wanted more detail, professional obligation, something about the structure of the post or the region that had been problematic. I gave her nothing useful. She finally accepted my 2-sentence exit statement, filed the paperwork, and I walked away with 6 months of accumulated pay and a contract officially dissolved. That night, in a motel room in Millspur, I sat on the bed and let what had happened start to crystallize into comprehension. For weeks, I'd been in a state of acute response. Document, analyze, survive. Now, removed from the immediate threat, the implications began to settle. The creature had been intelligent. It had communicated. It had been trying to reach me, not just through violence but through those vocalizations that suggested something like language. In the hikers' research, their casual mention of a creature that had been hunting in the region for at least 5 years suggested something far larger than a single animal problem. This was a population. This was habitat. This was something that had found the Appalachian wilderness suitable enough to maintain and reproduce. Everything the rangers did, maintaining trails, clearing dead trees, managing the forest, was happening in what had become someone else's domain. The thought kept me awake, staring at the motel ceiling, listening to the sounds of the distant highway that meant civilization and safety and connection to a larger world. In the morning, I made the first call I'd made in a month to my ex-wife. I asked if I could see Mira that weekend. She was surprised. I had her on the following weekend according to our arrangement, but she agreed. I drove the 4 hours to the county where she lived, and I picked up my daughter on Saturday morning. Mira was wearing a soccer uniform, her hair in a ponytail, her face expressing the particular mix of enthusiasm and reluctance that 12-year-olds perfect. She got in the car and asked where we were going. "Wherever you want," I said. "I thought we'd just drive around, maybe get food somewhere you like, just spend time." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully interpret, some mixture of concern and caution. "Are you okay, Dad?" The question was more perceptive than she probably realized. I wasn't okay. I was someone who'd been touched by something that existed outside the normal categories of understanding, and I was trying to pretend I could just slide back into the routines of ordinary life. "I'm better now," I said, which was true in a limited sense. "I needed to spend time with you." We went to a diner she liked, got lunch, drove around looking at fall foliage that was fading toward winter. I asked her about school, about her friends, about the things that mattered in her world. She answered in the abbreviated way of pre-teenagers, offering basic information without much elaboration. But slowly, as we drove, she relaxed, and our conversation developed some actual depth. She told me about a conflict with a friend, about a teacher she found frustrating, about plans for winter break that she was looking forward to. I listened, and for several hours I was able to push the memory of the cabin and the creature and the screams from the forest into the background. I was just a father trying to be present with his daughter, trying to rebuild connection in the space my absence had created. When I dropped her off that evening, she hugged me longer than she usually did. "I'm glad you're back," she said, and I realized she'd interpreted my time at the ranger station as something like imprisonment, a place I'd been obligated to be rather than a place I'd chosen. "Me too," I said, and I meant it. Over the next 2 weeks, I pursued research. Not through official channels. I'd learned that government agencies would neither confirm nor help investigate the problem I'd encountered, but through the same routes the hikers' research would have gone. I found online forums dedicated to cryptid research, communities that discussed Appalachian folklore with the kind of obsessive detail usually reserved for academic work. In those forums, I found dozens of accounts, not first-hand encounters. Those were rare and often removed by forum moderators as unreliable, but documented patterns. Disappearances in the 1960s, the 1980s, clusters of missing persons in remote valleys of Kentucky and West Virginia. Official reports attributed them to hiking accidents, voluntary relocations, criminal activity, but the patterns existed if you looked for them. One account, posted by someone with the username Ridgelore, described almost exactly what I'd experienced. A ranger at an unnamed Appalachian station, escalating incidents over several weeks, attempted breaches, a decision to leave. But this account was 7 years old, and in the responses other users described similar experiences. A ranger who'd left abruptly, a woman hiker who'd gone missing, multiple incidents at different times and places, but with enough consistency to suggest they weren't random. Someone on the forum had compiled a map of incidents, plotting them geographically across the Appalachian region. The clusters were clear: certain valleys, certain ridges, places where something maintained territory and hunted. I sent a private message to Ridgelore and waited for a response. The response came 3 days later, carefully worded, asking how I knew the details of their post. I realized they were being cautious, and justifiably so. Talking about what had happened to them could be dangerous professionally or legally if the Forest Service found out someone was discussing their experience with the public. Over the course of a month, Ridgelore and I corresponded. They confirmed details I hadn't included in my first message. They described the same creature, the same intelligence, the same escalation pattern, and they told me something crucial. They'd tried to warn the ranger replacement, just as the hikers had tried to warn me, and their replacement had also left early, though officially he'd quit due to budget restructuring. "I think the creature learns," Ridgelore wrote. "I think it understood what I was trying to do when I left notes and warnings. I think that's partly why it left me alone. I'd become aware, and awareness makes you harder prey." I asked them what happened to the rangers after they left, after they'd broken their contracts. Ridgelore said they'd moved on, tried to rebuild, mostly succeeded in creating distance from what they'd experienced. But the weight of the knowledge never fully left. Once you understood that something like that existed, that official systems would neither acknowledge nor address it, the world felt fundamentally different. "You'll adapt," they wrote. "People do, but you'll never be able to unknow what you know. And every autumn you'll feel it, the pull back to that place. Some part of you will wonder about it, will want to understand what it was, what it wanted." They were right. By the time December arrived, despite my resolve to stay grounded in the world of people and cities and normal human concerns, I was researching. I was trying to understand what I'd encountered through the lens of indigenous knowledge systems, through historical records, through the fragments of information scattered across the internet from people who'd also encountered the impossible and tried to make sense of it. What emerged wasn't a clear answer, but it was a coherent pattern. The creatures existed in multiple Appalachian regions. They were territorial but not strictly solitary. They were intelligent enough to understand human behavior and exploit it. They were predatory, certainly, but the predation seemed to follow specific patterns, not random hunting but targeted acquisition, and they had adapted to coexist with human civilization, learning to exploit the gaps where people were isolated, learning the routines of rangers and hikers and the occasional desperate person seeking wilderness solitude. The indigenous knowledge suggested they were old, far older than European settlement of North America. Various tribes had names for them, all translated roughly as the Eaters or the Hungry Ones, or in the case of the Wendigo folklore, creatures associated with isolation, starvation, and the transformation of human into something other. But what they actually were, biologically, ecologically, in any framework that science could accept, remained unknowable. The evidence was scattered, anecdotal, often circumstantial. Systematic study was impossible because acknowledgement was dangerous. The Forest Service would not investigate. The academic institutions had other priorities. What existed was a kind of informal network of people who'd encountered the problem and survived it. We found each other, sometimes deliberately and sometimes by accident, and we shared information in encrypted forums and private messages in carefully coded language, and we watched, every year, new disappearances in the Appalachian region. Every year, new clusters that followed no logical pattern to search and rescue teams but made perfect sense if you understood that something was hunting. Every year, new rangers arrived at remote stations, and some of them left early, their contracts terminated for vague personal reasons. Most didn't survive their encounter. Ridgelore told me that after I'd established my credentials and proven myself trustworthy. The creature at Ridge Lake, they believed, was old and sophisticated. Most of the creatures, based on the incident patterns, were less subtle. They took people quickly. They didn't engage in weeks of escalating communication. They hunted. The one at Ridge Lake had been testing me, trying to determine if I could be integrated somehow, could be used, could be converted. That was what happened to some people. They encountered the creature, succumbed to something in it, and became something other. Or they died and fed it. Or, like me, they escaped and carried the knowledge with them. A kind of living warning to anyone else foolish enough to seek isolation in the Appalachian wilderness. By the following autumn, I'd stopped researching actively. The weight of the knowledge had settled into a kind of baseline acceptance. There were creatures in the wilderness that shouldn't exist according to official science. People disappeared. Systems did not acknowledge the problem. I had escaped, and many others had not. That was the reality. I stayed close to Mira. I worked a job that kept me around people. I dated someone briefly, though I broke it off because the deception required. Not telling her anything about what I'd seen, what I knew, felt like a violation of something important. I moved forward, but every autumn I felt it. The hunger for the silence. The pull toward the ridges where no one went, where the forest belonged entirely to what was wild. And I understood, in a way that had become almost instinctual, that this feeling was dangerous. The creatures had something to do with that pull, or perhaps the pull was entirely human, the longing for escape, for complete isolation, for the illusion that we could separate ourselves from civilization and survive. And the creatures had simply adapted to exploit what was already broken in us. 2 years after leaving Ridge Lake Station, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The sender identified themselves as part of a private research collective that studied what they called cryptofaunal populations in North American wilderness regions. They'd found my interactions in the forums. They were impressed by the quality of my observations and my integration of the hikers' information. They wanted to know if I'd be interested in contractual work. The email was careful, full of plausible deniability language. But I understood what they were asking. They wanted me to return to the wilderness, to seek out these creatures, to document them systematically. I almost said yes. There was something seductive about the offer, about the idea of approaching the thing not as a victim to be preyed upon but as a researcher to be understood. But I'd learned enough by then to recognize that as a trap. The invitation to understand was also an invitation to approach, to engage, to put myself back in proximity to something that had been testing the boundaries of my existence for weeks. I declined, politely and finally, but the contact forced me to acknowledge something I'd been avoiding. I wasn't going to move on completely. The knowledge was going to shape the rest of my life, would call to me every autumn, would inform decisions I didn't realize I was making. So I made a choice. I relocated to a position in a research facility in Northern California, working for a university program that studied forest ecology. The position paid well, included benefits, and was located in a region far from the Appalachian wilderness where the creatures maintained territory. It was a deliberate geographical choice, a kind of permanent separation. Mira came to visit once that year. She was 13 now, more comfortable with long drives, and she seemed interested in my work. I took her into the research facility, showed her the computer systems and the data we collected, tried to give her a window into the kind of work that had drawn me to the Forest Service in the first place. She asked me why I'd left the ranger position. I told her I'd found that I preferred studying the forest to managing it, working with data to working alone in the field. It was a sufficient answer for her. I don't think she sensed the way my hands tightened when autumn began to approach, or noticed that I spent my weekends in places surrounded by people, places where the sound of traffic and human activity formed a kind of protective barrier between me and the silence I feared. The research facility kept me busy. We were studying the impacts of climate change on old-growth forest composition, comparing historical data with current observations, modeling future scenarios. It was good work, meaningful in its own way. I had colleagues, real conversation, the structure of institutional employment, but I never stopped following the disappearance patterns. I still maintained connections in the cryptofaunal research communities. I still read the reports, the accounts, the careful documentation of people who were trying to understand what lived in the places we still hadn't mapped completely. What I discovered, over the course of 3 years, was that the creatures seemed to be adapting. The disappearance patterns shifted. New territories were being occupied. In some regions, the incidents were increasing. In others, creatures seemed to be withdrawing deeper into the wilderness. There was also evidence that they were interacting with each other in ways we didn't fully understand. Predation, certainly, but possibly also communication, cooperation, possibly even something that resembled social structure. One researcher suggested they might be a species capable of rapid evolution, adapting to changing environmental pressures in ways that allowed them to modify behavior and territory use within relatively short timeframes. It was academic speculation, the kind of thing you could discuss in encrypted forums with anonymized colleagues, but it carried implications. If these creatures were adapting successfully to changing conditions, their population might be growing, their territory might be expanding. 5 years after I left Ridge Lake, I received a message from a ranger I didn't know. He was at a station in the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. He'd found references to my experience in the forums, and he was asking if the symptoms he was experiencing, the sounds at night, the presence he sensed at the edges of his awareness, the feeling of being watched and cataloged, were what I'd experienced. I told him the truth. I told him what I'd seen, what I'd understood, what I'd done to survive. And I told him the thing I'd learned that no one else would say. The creature might let you go. If you leave, if you run, if you put enough distance between yourself and it quickly enough, it might not pursue. But if you stay, if you try to understand it, if you engage with it, it will take you. Not through violence necessarily, but in whatever way serves its needs. The ranger, his name was Oswin, wrote back the next day. He'd left his post the morning after reading my response. He was gone by noon. He walked out of the wilderness with supplies for 2 days hiking, and he made it to the nearest town by evening. I never heard from him again, but I saw his name appear in the network 6 months later. He was working for the same private research collective that had tried to recruit me. He'd chosen to integrate the knowledge, to work with the people studying the phenomenon, to transform his experience into a kind of expertise. I understood the appeal. Bearing witness to something impossible, and then being able to collaborate with others who understood the scale of the problem created a kind of community. It was a way to make meaning from trauma, to position yourself as part of a solution rather than as a victim. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't go back, even in an official capacity. The pull was too strong, and I understood myself well enough to know that another encounter with the wilderness would test whether I could escape a second time. By the time Mira turned 18, she'd heard fragments of my history. Not the full story. I've never told anyone the complete version, but enough to know that something significant had happened during my time as a ranger. She asked me directly one afternoon when she was home from her first year of college. "What happened in Appalachia?" she asked. "Something scared you badly. I can feel it when we talk about wilderness or hiking or anything related to remote places." I considered lying. I considered the generic explanation I'd used with her mother and most of the people in my life. But Mira deserved better, and she was old enough to handle truth even when it was difficult. I told her about the creature. Not the details. Those seemed unnecessary. But the essential fact. I'd encountered something impossible, had to choose between understanding it and escaping it, and chose escape. That choice had shaped the rest of my life in ways both obvious and subtle. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "Do you regret leaving, not coming back to understand what it was?" "Every autumn," I said. "But regret doesn't mean I made the wrong choice." She nodded, and I saw her processing that. She'd inherited, I think, something of the tendency to seek isolation, to find peace in wilderness. But she'd also inherited something else, the ability to recognize when a pull towards something could destroy you. By now it's been over a decade since I left Ridge Lake. I'm established in my position, respected in my field, integrated into a life that has meaning and structure. Mira is pursuing environmental science, ironically enough, studying the ecological impacts of human presence on forest systems. I've had to be careful about which projects I accept, which regions I'm willing to work in. The Appalachian region is off limits. I won't travel there, won't review data collected there, won't engage with research focused on that area. It's a boundary I've set to protect myself from the pull that never fully disappears. But the creatures persist. New disappearances every year, new patterns, new evidence that something is learning to coexist with human civilization more effectively. Some researchers believe they're capable of manipulating human behavior at a level we don't fully understand. that the vocalizations that seemed like communication might be something more sophisticated, some form of influence that affects the people who hear them. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if what I experienced was a unique creature or a common one. I don't know if my escape was because I was stronger or simply because I was lucky. I don't know if the hikers are actually dead or if they found their way into something else, some transformation that the creature offered to those who stayed long enough to receive it. What I know is this: the wilderness is not empty, the maps are incomplete, and the darkness that exists in the Appalachian forests, the actual darkness that begins each evening and extends until dawn, contains something that is watching the clearings, watching the structures humans build, watching the isolated people who choose to be alone in spaces where they don't belong. I learned to stop being one of those isolated people. I learned to stay in the light, to surround myself with voices and presence in the small reassurances that come from existing among other humans. I learned that running is not failure. Sometimes it's the most intelligent response to a situation beyond comprehension. And every autumn, when the season turns and the nights grow long, I feel it still, not the creature itself, but the echo of its attention, the knowledge that it's still there, still learning, still adapting. The Appalachian Ridge keeps its secrets. The maps remain incomplete, and somewhere, in the places where the trails end and the forest becomes entirely its own territory, something old and intelligent and patient is still waiting in the dark. That's not a nightmare that ends when you wake up. That's just the reality of a world larger and stranger than we're willing to admit. And peace, in the end, is just the distance we maintain from it.